Hey there and welcome back. It is late now, later perhaps than you meant it to be, and the day has finally loosened its hold on you. Whatever you carried through it, the noise and the worries that gathered at the edges, you are allowed to set all of it down. This is one of those evenings made for going somewhere else entirely, somewhere old and gilded, and far from anything that wants a single thing from you. It is for you, lying still in the dark with the lamp turned low, ready to be lifted out of your own century for a while. And I would like to take you there tonight, if you will let me, not as a lesson but as a journey, the kind you can sink into and simply follow until your eyes grow heavy and the room begins to fade. You need do nothing at all but breathe and listen and let the years fall away beneath you. Tonight we are travelling to the court of the Sun King, to the palace of Versailles in its first dazzling youth, to walk beside a woman who once governed that court more surely than any anointed Queen of France. She was a creature of wit and beauty and fierce unsleeping ambition who rose higher than almost any subject of her age had ever dared to rise, and who would one terrible winter hear her own name spoken aloud in the confession of a poisoner. Before we cross fully into that vanished world, let me say one thing and then leave the spell unbroken until the very end. These long evenings of history are something I make for people who are, I suspect, a good deal like you, people who find a strange and welcome comfort in slipping back through the centuries once the house has gone quiet. If that is you, and if you would like more nights such as this one to find their way to you, you are always welcome to subscribe, so that the next journey arrives without your ever having to go looking for it. And should you feel moved to leave a few words below, telling me where in the world you are settling down to listen, or whose life you would like us to wander into next, I look through those messages more often than you might believe, and they quietly shape the evenings still to come. That is all I ask. Now let us go where we promised to go. Picture this. It is an evening in the late 1600s, and the young palace of Versailles burns with candlelight on the flat, drained land to the west of Paris. 10,000 flames stand doubled in tall mirrors and in the black glass of the windows. Fountains throw their silver into the dusk, and the gardens beyond run away in ruled avenues toward a canal so long that a barge upon it looks like a toy. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of orange flowers forced in silver tubs, with beeswax and powder, and the faint sweetness of melting wax. A river of people moves through the painted rooms, and at the heart of that river, where the candlelight gathers brightest, walks a tall woman with masses of fair curling hair, and eyes that miss nothing. The whole court bends toward her as grass bends toward the sun. To understand how she came to stand there, at the very centre of the most magnificent court in Europe, we have to go back first to a quieter country, and to a child born into one of the proudest families in France. She came into the world on the 5th of October, in the year 1640, in the old province of Poitou, in the soft green country to the south, where the rivers run lazily toward the sea, and the light has a particular honeyed quality in the long evenings of summer. Her name, the long ancestral name she would carry like a banner all her life, was Francoise-Athenais de Rochechouart de Mortemart. The world would come to know her by a married title she half despised, but the family she was born into mattered far more to her than any husband ever would. And to understand her you must first understand the blood she was so proud of. The house of Rochechouart was ancient beyond easy reckoning, older by centuries than many of the duchies that fawned upon it, a line of feudal lords whose roots ran back into the dim beginnings of the kingdom itself. The Mortemart branch of that house was prouder still, and it bred a particular kind of person, brilliant, disdainful, and certain to the marrow of its own superiority. The France into which she was born was not yet the serene and dazzling kingdom she would help to adorn. In that year the old king, Louis XIII, still reigned, a melancholy and suspicious man, and the true master of the realm was his great minister, the Cardinal Richelieu, who was even then breaking the power of the proud nobles and dragging France by main force toward the centralized glory that his successors would inherit. A long and ruinous war was grinding across Europe. The kingdom was heavy with taxes, and rebellion simmered in the provinces, and the child who would one day rule that world of the Sun King was himself a little boy of 2 summers, the Dauphin Louis, growing up in his nurseries while the infant Athenais grew up in hers, the two of them, the future king and his future mistress, drawing their first breaths in the same troubled France within a year or 2 of one another. It is a strange thing to hold in the mind, those 2 small lives beginning so far apart in such different stations, and bending all the while, though neither could know it, toward the one bright meeting that would shape both their histories. There is an old jest about the family that carries a real truth inside it, that the Mortemarts could trace their ancestors so far back that they had grown weary of the labour and given it up. Athenais grew up steeped in exactly that conviction. She knew with a certainty that nothing in her long life ever shook, that her blood was finer than that of half the princes who would one day crowd to flatter her, finer in her own private estimation than the blood of the monarch himself, whose Bourbon line she considered, with the lethal Mortemart contempt, to be very grand but rather new. This was not a passing vanity. It was the bedrock of her character. A woman so sure of her own worth feels entitled to the highest place in any room she enters, and behaves accordingly. And Athenais entered every room of her life as though it had been built and lit expressly for her arrival. Her father was Gabriel de Rochechouart, Duc de Mortemart, a charming and extravagant nobleman of the old courtly stamp, a man far more gifted at wit and pleasure than at the dull business of keeping his estates in repair. He was a favourite of the old king, and then of the young one, a fixture of that world, beloved for his conversation, and forever a little embarrassed for money, for the grand manner does not come cheap, and the Mortemarts kept it up whatever the cost. Her mother was Diane de Grandseine, a woman cut from quite different cloth, devout, sensible, and clever, who served as a lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother, and who held the leaking family fortunes together by a mixture of shrewd management and constant prayer. From this marriage of brilliance and piety the children took their double inheritance, the dazzling tongue of their father, and buried deeper and waiting its hour, the religious conscience of their mother, for the children were as remarkable as the parents, and the family gift ran strong in all of them. Athenais had 2 sisters and a brother who each made a mark. One sister, Gabrielle, became the Marquise de Thianges, reckoned at court almost as witty and quite as beautiful as Athenais herself. Another, Marie Madeleine, took the veil and rose to be the abbess of the great royal convent of Fontevraud, a learned and formidable woman who governed monks as well as nuns and was said to have translated Plato for her own amusement. The brother, Louis Victor, became the Duc de Vivonne, a soldier and admiral, and another celebrated wit, a vast genial mountain of a man whom the sovereign teased about his bulk. Together these brilliant, mocking, golden Mortemart children were one of the wonders of the court, and the thing the whole of France marvelled at in all of them was the manner of their talk. The world gave it a name, the Esprit Mortemart, the Mortemart wit, and it was a thing more particular than mere cleverness. It was a music as much as a meaning, a way of phrasing, a drawling, caressing irony, the trick of saying the most devastating thing in the gentlest voice, so that the blow landed before the victim had quite understood that a blow was coming. They could make a person ridiculous in a single murmured sentence, and do it so elegantly that the whole room laughed, and the victim himself half wished to laugh too. Athenais possessed this gift in its purest and most dangerous form. It made her enchanting, and it made her feared, and she would learn in the years ahead that a tongue like hers could open every door at court, and could also, if it was not governed with care, slam them all shut again. These golden, mocking siblings would matter to her story long after the nursery, for they did not scatter to the four winds as siblings so often do, but rose together, around her and with her, until the Mortemarts became a kind of brilliant confederacy at the very heart of the royal household. To climb in that world a person needed allies, and Athenais had hers in her own blood, a brother and sisters as quick and as ambitious and as ferociously well-spoken as herself, so that when at last she reached for the summit, she did not reach alone, but at the head of a whole gifted clan, all of them sharpening their inimitable tongues in concert. It was a formidable thing, this family in its pride and its dazzle, and even the sovereign himself, who feared very little in this world, is said to have grown a touch wary of becoming the subject of the dreaded private laughter of the Mortemarts. The house she grew up in, when the family was not trailing after the court, was a manor of grey stone among the vineyards and oak woods of the west, a place of provincial grandeur shadowed always by debt. It was the kind of grandeur that polishes its silver and quietly pawns its peace, that keeps a fine table and dreads the arrival of its creditors. The children teased and sparkled and understood one another perfectly in the brittle, brilliant way of clever families, and Athenais, the golden beauty of the brood, fair-haired where Mortemarts were often dark, with the high colour and the long aristocratic bones the age admired, carried herself from her earliest girlhood, as though she had already been promised something the rest of the world had not yet thought to give her. That assurance never once left her. It was there in the manor garden among the bees, and it would be there, decades on, in the mirrored galleries of Versailles, and it would be there, terribly, at the very end. But before that world, before Louis, before any of the splendour or the ruin, there was a convent, and a girl learning to read her Psalter by the cold light of a high window in the town of Santes. That is exactly where we are going next. When Athenais was still a girl, her parents did what proud and impecunious families across France did with their daughters, and sent her away to be educated by the nuns. The convent chosen was the great Benedictine Abbey of Sainte Marie at Santes, an ancient house of high cool cloisters and disciplined hours, standing in the old Roman town on the river Charente, where the daughters of the Western nobility were sent to be polished into the women they were meant to become. The town itself was a place of weathered antiquity, with the broken arch of a Roman gateway still standing among the houses and the stumps of an amphitheatre, sunk in the green hillside above the river, so that a thoughtful child boarding there grew up among the bones of one vanished empire, while being prepared for service at the glittering centre of another. There she passed several of the formative years of her childhood, and the place left a deeper mark on her than she would have cared to admit, for it gave her two things she would carry to the grave: the outward graces of a great lady, and the inward seed of a faith that would lie dormant for 30 years, and then, at the last, overwhelm her. The days within those walls were ordered by the bell. The religious life of a Benedictine house turned upon the round of the offices, the hours of prayer that divided the day from the dark before dawn to the last office at nightfall, and a girl boarded among the nuns lived within the rhythm of it, even if she did not rise for every service. She learned her catechism and her psalms, and to write a fair clear hand, and to keep accounts, and to embroider with the fine patient needlework that filled the long afternoons. She learned a little Latin, enough to follow the chant and the readings, and a good deal of music, for the convents were nurseries of music, and a well-bred girl was expected to sing and to touch the harpsichord. Above all, she learned the bearing of a woman of rank, how to enter a room, how to sink and rise in a curtsy, how to govern her face and her voice, the whole grammar of aristocratic grace that could not be taught at home and could not be done without at court. The nuns who taught her were not, in the main, harsh women. Many were themselves the daughters of noble houses, placed in religion because there had not been dowry enough to marry every girl of a large family, and they ran their schoolroom with the worldly good sense of women, who knew exactly what kind of life their pupils were being readied for. It was here, too, that she first learned the deep music of the church, which would mean nothing to her for 30 years and then mean everything. The chant rising in the choir at dusk, the long psalms whose words she sang before she understood them, the slow procession of the liturgical year with its fasts and feasts, its purple and its gold, sank into her without her knowing, a melody learned in childhood that waits silent in the memory for the day it is needed. She would spend the prime of her life as far from that music as a soul can travel, in the blaze of the world, deaf to it by choice. And then when the world had used her and cast her down, she would find it still there, faithful, waiting, the one thing the convent gave her that the years could never take away, and she would return to it like a traveller coming home in the dark to a house where a single lamp has been left burning all the years of her absence. It would be quite wrong, then, to imagine these years as a misery, or the convent as a grim prison. The great abbeys of that century were nothing of the kind. They were small worlds of their own, often comfortable and sometimes frankly worldly, governed by abbesses who were themselves great ladies, frequently of the very families whose daughters they taught, and who knew precisely how to make much of a girl of the Mortemart blood. There was good food and decent wine at the abbess's table. There were visits and letters and news carried in from beyond the walls. There was a parlour where well-born relatives came to call, and gossip flowed as freely as it did in any drawing-room. There were other clever, well-born girls to befriend and to spar with, and the long-ordered days left ample room for the talk and the reading that a quick mind craves. Athenais, who was sharp and curious, and loved nothing better than a worthy opponent in conversation, was almost certainly not unhappy at Santes. The clever are rarely wholly miserable wherever there are books and other clever minds to test themselves against, and a Benedictine abbey of that age offered both in plenty. And yet, even behind those thick old walls, she could feel the distant pull of the larger world she was made for. She knew where her family belonged, at court, in the dazzle, among the brilliant people who ruled and amused the kingdom, and she strained toward it the way a young falcon frets at the jesses. The convent taught her patience and polish and the outward forms of devotion, but it could not teach her contentment with obscurity, and it could not teach her, or rather it taught her, and she did not learn, the one lesson that would have spared her so much, that the God whose psalms she sang so prettily in the choir kept his own patient accounts, and that a debt owed to him is not so easily deferred as a debt owed to a Paris tradesman. Her devotion in those years was real, but it was the easy, untried devotion of a child who has never yet been tempted by anything worth the name of temptation. It is a simple matter to be good at 12 years old, shut away among nuns, with nothing in sight worth coveting. The true test of a faith comes later, when the world spreads out its full table and asks what one will trade for a place at it, and Athenais, when that test came, would trade a very great deal indeed. Yet the faith itself never wholly died, and that is the strange and crucial truth of her whole story, the thread you must keep hold of as we go on. She was never an unbeliever. She was never able to sin in comfort, never able to silence the small grave voice she had first heard in the choir at Santes. The girl who knelt there would become the most scandalous woman in France, and the scandal would torment her precisely because she had not lost her faith, but only set it aside, like a letter she fully meant to answer and could not yet bear to open. Keep that quiet contradiction in your mind as the splendour rises, for it explains a great deal that the splendour alone never could, and it waits for her, with the patience of all unanswered things at the far end of her life. When her schooling was done, she came home, and the family turned at once to the only career open to a beautiful, well-born, and very nearly portionless girl, which was to be seen and admired and married well, and made, if fortune smiled, into an ornament of that world. And here the great name did its work, as proud names do. Through her mother's place in the Queen Mother's household, and the long credit of the Mortemart blood, a position was found for the young Athenais at court itself, in the household of the new queen, and so, while still very young, she left the green country of her childhood behind her, and travelled north into the dazzle and the peril of the most splendid court in the world. Let me bring you into that court now, so that you can feel the size and the heat of the thing she had walked into, for it was unlike anything France, or indeed Europe, had ever seen. Louis XIV had come into his full power only a little before. The long shadow of his great minister, the Cardinal Mazarin, who had governed in the monarch's name through his childhood and youth, had lifted at last with the cardinal's death, and the young king, not yet 25, had astonished his ministers and his court by announcing that henceforth he would rule alone, that he would be his own first minister, that he would suffer no overmighty subject to stand between himself and the governing of France. He was a man of no more than middling height, made to seem tall by the sheer magnificence of his carriage, dark-eyed and grave, schooled in iron self-command, with an appetite for glory that would shape the whole of Europe for half a century to come. And around himself he was beginning to build a machine for the manufacture of splendour, a court designed at once to dazzle the world and to tame the proud, dangerous nobility of France by drawing them in from their provinces and their private armies, and gathering them about his own person, in a gilded enclosure where the only coin worth having was the sovereign's regard. Alpa. In these early years the palace had no single fixed home, for the great palace in the western marshes was as yet only a small hunting lodge that Louis was beginning to dream of enlarging. The court moved instead among a string of royal houses, the old Louvre and the new Tuileries in Paris, the airy chateau of Saint-Germain-en-Laye on its terrace above the Seine, the forest palace of Fontainebleau where the autumn hunts were held. Wherever it settled, it carried with it the same dense, glittering, exhausting life, the same crowd of nobles jostling for a word or a look, the same minute and merciless etiquette in which a man's whole standing might hang upon whether he was permitted to hand the monarch his shirt at the morning rising. Into this restless travelling household, the young Marquise-to-be was fitted as a maid of honour to the Queen. The Queen was Marie-Therese of Spain, the sovereign's own first cousin and his wife by the treaty that had sealed the long peace between the two crowns. She was a small, fair, pious, kindly woman with not a great deal of conversation, homesick for the stiff, formal Spanish court of her girlhood, and forever a little bewildered by the irreverent, glittering French one she had married into. She loved her husband with a patient, baffled devotion, and she was, by every account that survives, genuinely and unaffectedly good. It was around this gentle and rather lonely queen that Athenais took up her first duties, carrying the train, attending at the toilette and the table, kneeling at the prayers and standing, hour upon weary hour, in the great press of the antechambers where the whole life of that world was lived in public. The duties of a maid of honour were not heavy, but they were unrelenting. She must be present, dressed and composed at the Queen's rising, and her retiring, at chapel and at table, ready at a word to fetch a fan or a shawl or a prayer book, and above all she must be ornamental, for a queen's attendants were part of a queen's magnificence. The long hours of waiting taught patience to those who possessed it, and bred intrigue in those who did not. For a young woman of wit and ambition, it was the finest schoolroom imaginable, far richer than Santis, and she set herself to study it, watching everything, forgetting nothing, learning who truly held power, and who only seemed to How a single glance from Louis could remake a fortune. How the great ladies fought their soundless wars with fans and seating, and the precedence of a stool. The whole life of the monarch was lived as a kind of sacred theatre, and she learned its every rite. The rising in the morning, when the curtains of the vast bed were drawn back, and the most privileged of the nobility were admitted by degrees to watch their master wash and dress, and be handed his garments by hands that counted it the highest honour of their lives. The public dinners, where the sovereign ate alone at a small table, while the courtiers stood and watched him chew. The evening assemblies, the chapel, the hunt, the going to bed, each with its fixed order and its jealous hierarchy of who might come close and who must keep their distance. To the uninitiated it was a baffling and tedious ballet, but to the ambitious it was the very map of power, for every gesture in it was a coin, every place in it a measure of favour, and a woman who understood it perfectly could read the standing of each soul at court as easily as reading a clock. Athenais learned to read it perfectly, and more, she learned to imagine herself at the centre of it, not among the watching crowd, but in the place where all the watching was directed, and the imagining did not feel to her like presumption but like prophecy. And hardest of all, for one so sharp of tongue, she made herself loved, learning to aim her wit with exquisite care, to amuse the powerful, and never to cut them, to be the most delightful companion in any room she entered. She was, the memoirs agree, enchanting in these early years. But a penniless maid of honour could not choose her own path. She was a piece on the board, and the family meant to move her, and so we come to the marriage that gave her the name that history remembers. The man chosen for her was Louis Henry de Pardian de Gondrin, Marquis de Montespan, and in the year 1663, when Athenais was 22 years old, they were married in Paris in the church of Saint Sulpice. He was a Gascon, from the hot, dry, proud country of the southwest, the land that has given France so many of its swaggering soldiers and its quarrelsome younger sons, and he had all the qualities that the legends fasten upon his kind. He was brave to the point of recklessness, proud past all reason, hot of temper, generous, when he had anything in his purse to be generous with, and almost always desperately, ruinously short of money. His family was good, but not great. A respectable house of the southern nobility, certainly not the equal of the Rochechouart de Mortemart and Athenais, who measured the whole world in the fine gradations of birth, never once let him forget the distance between her blood and his. From the very first, then, it was a match of equals in temper and unequals in pride, which is another way of saying that it was a match built for storms. There had been, before Montespan, a near miss with another and grander suitor, for the family had hoped at one point to marry their golden daughter to the Marquis de Noirmoutier, a gentleman of an old and powerful house. That connection came to nothing in the most violent fashion the age could devise, for the Marquis was swept up in one of the notorious duels of the day, a bloody affair of honour fought between two clusters of young noblemen, after which the survivors were obliged to flee the kingdom or lose their heads, Louis having set his face like flint against the duelling that thinned his nobility and flouted his law. Noirmoutier fled abroad, and the brilliant match fled with him, and the family turned to the next acceptable offer. So Montespan it was, and for a little while there was something between the young couple that might, in another life, have grown into a kind of happiness, or at least into the brisk affectionate partnership that passed for happiness in most marriages of that rank and age. They were both young, both handsome, both quick of tongue, and in the first season of it they seemed to have suited each other well enough. They had 2 children in the early years, a daughter, Marie Christine, whom they called Mademoiselle de Montespan, a frail child who would not live to grow up, and then a son, Louis Antoine, the little Marquis d'Antin, who would, against every odd of his strange beginnings, grow up to serve the monarch with such patient and untiring loyalty that he ended his days a duke and a great officer of the crown, the keeper of the sovereign's buildings and pleasures, the only one of all his mother's many children to be born in lawful wedlock and to bear his lawful father's name. For a few seasons the new married couple lived the ordinary life of their kind, dividing their time between rented lodgings in Paris and the husband's southern estates among the vineyards, appearing at court when they could afford the clothes for it, running up the bills that such a life demanded, and praying that the next campaign or the next inheritance would somehow set the accounts to rights. There is something to be said for the husband before the storms close over him entirely, for he was not a stupid man, nor wholly a brute, only a man badly matched and chronically out of pocket. He had served with courage in Louis's armies. He kept the rough, open-handed hospitality of his country, and in the southern manners of the Pardalen. Among the dry hills and the terraced vines, he was a person of consequence, a lord among his own people, whatever he might dwindle to in the cold, appraising eye of his wife. The trouble was that Athenais had not the smallest wish to be a lady amid the vines. She had been bred for the dazzle and the press of the court, for the talk and the rivalry and the great game of advancement, and a husband who could offer her only a draughty southern house and a name she reckoned middling was, to her, a kind of sentence rather than a marriage. The mismatch was not of character alone, but of appetite and direction. He looked south, to his estates and his debts and his soldiers' honour. She looked north, always north, to the blaze on the horizon where the monarch held his court, and she fretted in her provincial harness like a creature made for a finer cage. But money was always the trouble. Montespan had debts when he married, and he soon had a great many more, for he was the kind of man who answered the threat of ruin, not with prudent retrenchment but with grander gestures, raising companies of soldiers he could not pay for, chasing glory and ransom in the little wars on the kingdom's edges, borrowing against estates already mortgaged to the hilt, and then borrowing again against the borrowings. He would vanish to some campaign in Spain or on the southern frontier, leaving his wife behind, and return months afterwards with nothing to show but fresh wounds and fresh creditors, and a fund of soldiers' tales, and the household would lurch on from one unpaid tradesman to the next, the fine name forever outrunning the thin purse. For a woman of Athenais' tastes, her love of beautiful clothes and beautiful company, and the splendour that her blood seemed to entitle her to, the marriage soon curdled into something close to contempt. She had married a man who could give her neither security nor advancement, only debts and a southern name she reckoned beneath her, and she was not a woman to suffer such a disappointment in silence, nor to bear poverty with the meekness of a saint. And yet she needed him, and that is the deep irony at the heart of these years. The marriage she came to despise was the very thing that set her in the world and made her ascent possible. As the Marquise de Montespan, she had a married woman's standing, a household of her own, a settled and respectable footing at court that a mere unmarried maid of honour, however beautiful, could never have held alone. The unwed girl might be admired one season and quietly forgotten the next, packed off home to the provinces to make way for the next year's crop of beauties, her bloom wasted and her chances gone. Athenais, witty and well-born, and seen everywhere on her husband's arm and then increasingly without it, could become a fixture, and a fixture could become a power. Her husband, blundering and quarrelsome and forever absent chasing the money he could never keep, had handed her, without ever once meaning to, the very platform from which she would rise to a height that left him far, far below in the dust of his Gascon vineyards. He would never forgive her for it. But that reckoning was still to come, and when it came it would take a form so strange and so public that the whole of France would laugh and shudder at it in the same breath. For now return with me to that world, and to the sovereign's own heart, which in these years already belonged to another woman entirely. For Louis XIV, so magnificently disciplined in every other corner of his life, so much the master of his face and his appetites and the very minutes of his crowded day, was not disciplined in love, and never would be. A king of that age was expected to keep a mistress, almost as a matter of state and certainly as a matter of fashion, a public ornament of his magnificence as much as a private indulgence, and Louis kept one, and the whole court knew her, and watched her, and measured its conduct by the temperature of the royal regard. And her name was Louise de la Valliere, and she was, in nearly every particular, the living opposite of the woman who was even then beginning, from her place among the Queen's attendants, to measure the distance to her throne. Louise was gentle, modest, and genuinely, helplessly in love with Louis for himself, rather than for his crown or his gifts. She had come to court as a maid of honour in the household of the monarch's sister-in-law, a girl of no great fortune and no great family, and she had caught the young king's eye precisely because she seemed to want nothing from him but himself. She had a slight unevenness in her walk, the trace of a fall in childhood, which somehow only deepened the tender appeal of her rather than marring it, and a soft melancholy sweetness that the young Louis, in the first flush of his independent power, had found wholly irresistible. Their affair had begun some years before, conducted at first under the thin and courtly disguises that fooled no one and were not really meant to, and for a time it had been a thing of real and private tenderness, as near to honest love as the life of a king allows. She had borne him children. She had been raised against her own retiring inclination to the rank and title of Duchess, and given an estate to match it. 2 of her children by the sovereign lived, and were acknowledged, and raised up and legitimized, so that even the gentle, self-effacing La Valliere left her mark upon the royal house. But she took little joy in these honours, which seemed to her the wages of her sin rather than the rewards of love, and she would in time leave her children, as she left everything else, walking away from them into her convent with a resolution that astonished a court for which a mother's natural feeling was a smaller thing than the call of God. It was the measure of the woman that she could give up even her children for the peace of her soul, and the measure of the gulf between her and Madame de Montespan, who would cling to her own children as the last solace of her ruined years, and press their fortunes to the very end. But Louise had no taste whatever for power, and no skill in the cruel close arts of that world, the arts of faction and flattery and the soundless war of precedence. She loved the man and shrank from the splendour that loving him had brought her, and that very shrinking, that genuine and unfashionable goodness, would in the end prove her undoing. For Louis was a man who in time grew weary of whatever did not glitter, and Louise, for all her sweetness, did not glitter. To understand the temptation that was forming, you must understand the man at the centre of it, for everything at that court turned upon him as the planets turn upon the sun, and the comparison was one he chose for himself and wore as his emblem. Louis was a man of iron routine and boundless appetite, who rose and dressed and dined and prayed and went to his council and his hunting and his bed by a timetable, so fixed that a courtier with a watch could have said, at any hour of the day, exactly where his master stood and what he did. He had been frightened in his boyhood by rebellion, by the great revolt of the nobles and the parliaments that had driven him as a child from his own capital in the night, and he had resolved, with the cold determination that was the deepest thing in him, that no subject should ever wield such power against him again. So he gathered the proud and dangerous nobility of France about his own person, in a gilded enclosure where the only coin worth having was his regard, and he made attendance upon himself the whole business of their lives, until a great duke counted it an honour to hold the royal candlestick at the going to bed. Into this disciplined and hungry world, the love of the monarch was the highest prize of all, higher than any office, for from it all other prizes flowed. And it was this prize dangled now before La Valliere, and soon to be snatched from her, that Athenais de Montespan had set her whole soul upon winning. Athenais de Montespan studied the reigning mistress with the cool, patient attention of a rival who has not yet shown her hand. On the surface, the two women were friends, and more than friends, for they moved in the same close circle, attended the same queen, shared the same long gilded afternoons in the same crowded antechambers, laughed at the same jests, knelt at the same prayers. La Valliere, trusting and quite without suspicion, seems to have been sincerely fond of the brilliant Madame de Montespan, to have sought her company, and confided in her, and depended on her good humour, never once dreaming that the dazzling friend at her side was quietly taking the measure of the throne she herself occupied with such evident unease. It was a friendship that would curdle, in time, into one of the most famous cruelties of the whole reign, and the cruelty, when it came, would be almost entirely upon one side. For what Athenais could see, and what the gentle Louise could not, was that the sovereign himself was changing. The tender young man so caught up in his first love was hardening year upon year into the great remote monarch he meant to become, and the great monarch was beginning to want a mistress who matched the towering scale of his ambitions, a woman who could preside, who could dazzle, who could turn his pleasures into spectacle, and his court into the wonder of the watching age. He wanted, in short, very nearly exactly what Athenais de Montespan was, and exactly what poor faithful Louise could never be, however long she wept and however true she stayed. All that was wanting was the occasion, the moment of nearness and opportunity in which Athenais might at last play the cards she had been holding so patiently against her breast. And the occasion, when it came, arrived wrapped in the noise, the colour and the dust of war. The war that gave Athenais her opening is known to history as the War of Devolution, and like most of Louis's wars, it began in a tangle of law and pride and the hunger for glory. The monarch's wife, Marie-Thérèse, was a daughter of the King of Spain, and her marriage treaty had promised a great dowry which Spain, being poor and proud and chronically embarrassed for ready coin, had never troubled to pay. Louis's lawyers, hunting for a pretext to push his frontier northward into the rich and crowded towns of the Spanish Netherlands, fastened upon an old local custom of those provinces, the law of devolution, by which, in certain inheritances, property passed to the children of a first marriage in preference to those of a second, and they argued, with the straight face of well-paid advocates, that by this private custom the Netherlands themselves had devolved upon the Queen as her father's eldest daughter. It was a lawyer's fiction stretched taut over a soldier's ambition, and nobody in Europe was deceived by it for a moment, but it served, and in the spring of the year 1667 the sovereign marched north to make it good, at the head of a glittering army, to seize in his wife's name the towns he had decided to want. In Louis's mind, the campaign was as much a pageant as a war, and he meant to conduct it in the grandest possible style, a progress of conquest with himself as its radiant centre. He marched with his whole court trailing behind him in a long train of coaches and baggage wagons, miles in length, the Queen among them in her lumbering carriage, and the ministers, and the wits, and the cooks and the wardrobes, and the gilded camp furniture of a travelling palace, for it was the fashion of the age that the great campaigns should carry their own admiring audience to witness the royal triumphs. The monarch besieged towns in the cool of the morning, and supped under embroidered canvas by candlelight in the evening, and the ladies of the court watched the smoke of the guns drift over the ramparts of Tournai and Douai and Lille from a safe and comfortable distance, as though the siege were a spectacle laid on for their particular diversion, a fireworks of war. The strong towns fell one after another, almost as fast as the army could march to them, for the sovereign had the finest soldiers and the finest engineer in Europe, and the Spanish garrisons were starved and few, and Louis rode into his conquests in triumph through gates hung with hasty garlands, and the whole expedition had the air of a summer progress crowned with easy and inexpensive victories. Ned, the war ended almost as quickly as it had begun, for the alarmed powers of Europe, watching the young king swallow town after town, banded together to check him, and Louis, who had got the cream of what he wanted, chose to make peace rather than fight the whole continent at once. By the treaty that closed the affair, he kept a string of the conquered towns along his northern frontier, a permanent gain dressed up as a moderate settlement, and he came home garlanded with glory at small cost, his reputation as the first soldier king of the age established, his appetite for such ventures whetted rather than satisfied. For our story, the campaign matters less for the towns it won than for the heart it changed, for Louis returned from it, having made one conquest that no treaty recorded and no fortress could hold, the conquest of his own affections by the woman who had ridden north among the Queen's attendants and would ride home the mistress of the monarch. The guns of the north had been, in a sense, the music to which Madame de Montespan made her entrance. And on those long, dusty northern roads, in the jolting intimacy of shared lodgings and shared boredom and shared small dangers, Athenais de Montespan at last made her move. She was at the very height of her beauty now, in her middle 20s, ripe and golden and brilliant, with the high fair colouring the age adored and a figure not yet thickened by the childbearing that lay ahead, and she set herself, with all the art she had been hoarding through her watchful years among the Queen's women, to be irresistible to the sovereign. She was funny, where his life was heavy with ceremony and care and the unrelenting performance of majesty. She was bold and gay and sharp, where La Vallière was timid and tearful and forever apologizing for her own existence. She flattered Louis with the one flattery that even the most guarded clever man cannot quite resist, the flattery of a clever and beautiful woman who appears, with no apparent effort and no apparent design, to find him the most fascinating creature in the whole of creation. And she did it with the Mortemart art that left no fingerprints upon the glass, so that he felt himself not pursued but discovered, not flattered but understood. She would entertain the monarch and his circle through the long campaign evenings with her wicked, glittering talk, mimicking the absent, skewering the foolish, turning the day's small disasters and the courtier's small vanities into comedy, making the grave young monarch laugh aloud as he had half forgotten how to laugh. It is a strange thing, but the surest path to the heart of a man burdened with greatness is very often simply to make him forget his greatness for an hour, and this Athenais could do as no one else at court could do it. There was, besides, a piquant scandal in the very air of the thing that sharpened the king's appetite, for she was a married woman, and her temper of resistance, real or affected, the show she made at first of virtue and reluctance, only quickened the pursuit. By the time the army turned at last for home, the thing was done. The sovereign, who had set out to war with one mistress in his train, returned from it in love with another. There is a much-repeated story of that northern campaign, true or not in its particulars, but true to the spirit of the matter, that the Queen, lodged in a town not far from where the army lay, grew anxious for her absent husband and resolved to surprise him with a visit, and was kept from setting out by those about her who knew, as she did not yet, what she would find when she arrived. The poor Queen was nearly always the last to know, shielded by a court that found it easier to deceive her than to wound her, and she learned of each new grief in her marriage as the common people learn of a distant war, by rumour, and by the changed faces of those around her. When at length the truth of Athenais reached her, she wept and prayed and said little, for she had no weapon against it and no ally willing to take her part against the king's pleasure. Spain had taught her endurance, and the church had taught her resignation, and she fell back upon both, and watched her husband ride home from the war he had made in her name, in love with one of her own attendants. Madame de Montespan had become the king's mistress, and the long, gentle reign of Louise de la Vallière was over, though the poor woman herself would be among the very last in all of France to admit that it was so. What followed was one of the strangest and cruelest passages in the whole history of that court, and I will tell it to you plainly, because the cruelty is part of who Athenais was, and there is no understanding her dazzle honestly without it. Louis, for reasons of decency and disguise, did not at once dismiss the older mistress, nor even openly acknowledge the new one, for the queen was to be spared the affront, and the proprieties were to be kept up. Instead, for a long and painful while, he kept both women about him together, the new love and the discarded one, and he housed them in adjoining apartments, so that the convenient fiction might be maintained that he was visiting the gentle Duchess, when in truth he was passing through her rooms to reach Madame de Montespan in the chamber beyond. Louise de la Vallière, who had given the monarch her youth and her good name and her children and her whole undivided heart, was made to serve in effect as the very screen behind which her own supplanter received the man they both still loved. It is hard, even now, across all the centuries, to read of it without flinching on her behalf, and harder still to forgive the man and the woman who between them devised it. The two women shared their quarters and much of their daily round. They dressed in the same hours, dined at the same tables, knelt at the same mass, rode out in the same coaches, and the whole fascinated, appalled court looked on as the older love was slowly and publicly snuffed out, and the new one blazed up in its place with no curtain drawn over any part of the spectacle. Athenais, by the accounts that survive, did not trouble to soften the humiliation. She had a real streak of cruelty in her, the cold cruelty of the supremely confident toward the already defeated, and she used her famous wit upon La Vallière the way a cat uses its claws upon a creature it has already caught, and is in no hurry to kill, half in sport, and half in sheer surplus of power. There is a dreadful image that comes down to us from these years, of the two of them sharing a carriage on the road, the triumphant marquise sparkling and talking and laughing, as though nothing in the world were amiss, while beside her the discarded Duchess wept quietly behind her veil, trapped at the side of her rival, with nowhere in all the swaying, rattling coach to hide her tears. For the watching court, the slow martyrdom of La Vallière was an education in the new order of things, and the lesson was not lost on a single ambitious soul among them. Here was a woman who had been loved truly, raised to a duchy, mother of the king's children, and she counted for nothing now, less than nothing, a used screen propped in a doorway, because she had never learned to make herself necessary beyond the bare fact of being desired. Desire fades. The courtiers told one another behind their fans, and a wise woman builds upon something steadier than a man's wandering fancy, upon usefulness, upon faction, upon the iron grip of habit and need. They watched La Vallière fade, and they watched Montespan rise, and they drew their conclusions and adjusted their bows accordingly, transferring their small daily homages from the setting star to the rising one with the smooth instinct of people whose whole livelihood was the reading of the royal weather. It was a hard school, that world of the Sun King, and it taught one lesson above all others, that no place there was permanent but the sovereign himself, and that everyone else, however high they climbed, held their place on sufferance and at the king's whim, and might be a screen in a doorway tomorrow. Why did Louis permit it? Partly for the screen and the disguise it gave him, the thin decency that let him pretend before the Queen and the world that nothing had changed, partly because he was a man who hated scenes and ruptures above almost anything, and far preferred to let an awkward situation dissolve slowly of its own accord than to end it cleanly with a single honest stroke. And partly, one suspects, because the great machine of his court simply had no comfortable place for the open, formal dismissal of a woman he had once loved, and by whom he had acknowledged children. So La Vallière endured, season upon season, year upon year, growing thinner and graver and more inward, retreating ever deeper into the religion that had always been her one true refuge. She had glimpsed, through her own long suffering, the emptiness that lay behind all the glitter of it all, and at last she could bear the false position no longer. She tried once to escape it, fleeing to a convent in a sudden anguish, and was fetched back at the king's command, weeping, to take up her station again. But the longing had taken root, and would not be denied a second time. In the year 1674, after long preparation and that one false failed attempt at flight, Louise de la Vallière walked out of the palace of the Sun King forever, and entered the Carmelite convent in the faubourg of Paris, taking the veil under a new name, Sister Louise of Mercy, and submitting herself, a Duchess of France, to one of the harshest religious rules in all the kingdom. She gave away her rank, her wealth, her place, her children, and the world, and she lived on behind those bare walls for 36 years, in penance and prayer, and by every account that reached the outside, in a deep-settled peace that had been denied her in all her years of glory. She was buried at last in the habit of her order, mourned by no one at court who remembered why. The world did not quite forget her in those long cloistered years. Even so, great ladies came to the convent grill to visit the famous penitent, and were received with a grave, sweet courtesy that humbled them. For here was a Duchess of France who had given up everything, and seemed, against all reason, to have gained by the bargain. Athenais herself, it is said, came at least once to see the woman she had supplanted, and one can only wonder what passed between them across that iron grill, that the triumphant rival in her silks, and the barefoot nun in her rough habit, the one still climbing and the one wholly at rest. Whatever was said, the contrast cannot have been lost on Madame de Montespan, who would one day grope after exactly the peace the gentle La Vallière had found, and find it so much harder to come by. The discarded Duchess had walked away from the dazzle with empty hands and found something Athenais, for all her keeping of the field, never managed to seize. The court marvelled briefly at the strangeness of it. The Duchess turned barefoot nun, and then turned back to the dazzling figure, who now reigned alone and unrivalled. For Athenais the victory was complete, the field swept clear, the rival not merely beaten but vanished from the earth into a living grave. But the manner of it had set a pattern, the pattern of a reign that begins in another woman's tears, and patterns at that court had a way of coming round again in their appointed season, and finding a new face to weep behind the veil. The Marquis de Montespan was, as we have seen, a proud and hot-tempered Gascon, and he did not take the loss of his wife to the monarch with the smooth submission that custom expected of a man in his unfortunate position. The convention of that age was perfectly clear and perfectly cynical. A nobleman whose wife had the fortune to catch the royal eye was supposed to feel himself flattered, to absent himself with good grace, and to gather, in due season, the harvest of titles and pensions and governorships that flowed reliably to a complacent husband. Whole great families had been founded upon exactly such tactful blindness. The sovereign was open-handed to men who looked the other way at the right moment, and a sensible husband looked the other way, and grew rich and held his tongue, and reckoned himself well used by fortune. It is worth pausing on how thoroughly that bargain was understood and accepted, for it measures the strangeness of the world she had climbed into. The husband of a royal mistress was not pitied but envied, for his wife's dishonour was reckoned the surest road to his advancement, and there were men at that court who would have given a great deal to be so conveniently wronged. Pensions, governorships, regiments, the wardships of rich orphans, abbeys for their younger sons, places at court for their daughters. All the warm rain of royal bounty fell upon the man who knew when to be absent and how to be silent. A complacent spouse was a made man, and the world thought no worse of him for it, or rather thought the better of him for his good sense. To rage, to object, to insist upon the bare fact of one's marriage against the king's desire, was not held to be honourable, but merely stupid. A failure to grasp the plain arithmetic of self-interest by which sensible people govern their lives. And so the courtiers watched the Gascon's fury with the same delighted incomprehension it might have given a man who flung a winning hand of cards into the fire. Montespan would not look away, and he would not hold his tongue. Whether it was from genuine wounded love, or from outraged honour, or from the sheer ungovernable Gascon refusal to be made a public laughing-stock, he flew into a towering fury that scandalized the whole court and secretly delighted it. He raged at his wife and is said to have struck her. He stormed about Paris denouncing Louis to anyone who would stand still to listen, which at a court erected upon the absolute and sacred majesty of the monarch was something very close to madness. He demanded his wife back. He made scene upon scene. And then, when none of it availed him anything, he did the thing that fixed him forever in the legends of the reign and made his name a byword. He went into mourning. He dressed himself, and his servants, and his coach and horses, in the deepest black of bereavement, and he gave it out that his wife was dead, dead to him, and dead to honour, and he drove about the streets of Paris in this funeral equipage, so that the whole world should be obliged to witness his grief. He held, by some accounts, a mock funeral service for her. And most famous and most reckless of all, he had a great pair of antlers, the branching horns of a stag, mounted high above the door of his carriage, for the horns were the universal mocking emblem of the deceived husband, the cuckold, and so he paraded his shame deliberately through the capital, as a kind of accusation flung in the king's own face, that all might see what had been done to him, and by whom. It was magnificent, and it was very nearly suicidal. For one did not mock Louis XIV, and least of all did one mock him to his face, and least of all in the matter of his private pleasures, which he held to be the business of no one alive but himself. The king's patience, never long where his dignity was touched, ran swiftly out. The marquis was arrested, and shut up for a time in prison, and then, when he was let out, he was ordered away from the court and from Paris altogether, exiled to his own distant estates in the deep south of the kingdom, forbidden the capital, forbidden the king's presence, removed bodily from the stage upon which he had made so much unwelcome noise. He went, and for the most part he stayed gone, a banished and embittered man brooding among his vineyards while his wife reigned in glory hundreds of miles to the north. He outlived her in the end by a strange turn of fate, dying an old man long years after she was dust. And to the last he held himself a husband cruelly and shamefully wronged, which, by the plain reckoning of the human heart, if not by the cynical reckoning of that world, he had every right in the world to do. In his own later years he too turned toward religion, as so many of that generation did, and made his peace with heaven, if never with the king. But his great public defiance had one further consequence, and it would matter enormously in the years to come, reaching even into the lives of princes. Because Montespan had refused to play the complacent husband, because he had insisted so loudly and so publicly that he was and remained the lawful husband of Athenais, and would acknowledge no other arrangement under heaven, the children that Madame de Montespan bore to the king were placed in a strange and genuinely perilous legal position. By the settled law of France, a married woman's children were held in law to be her husband's, whatever the truth of their getting, and so any child Athenais bore might in cold legal theory be claimed by the furious Marquis as his own son or daughter, to be carried off to Gascony and raised as a pas de Jan. This was wholly intolerable to the king, who meant to raise his children by Athenais to the very heights of the kingdom. And so the whole elaborate machinery of secrecy that would surround those royal births, the concealment and the false names and the hidden nurseries that we shall come to shortly, grew in no small part out of the awkward, stubborn, unbudging fact of a husband who simply would not be bought off. The antlers on that black carriage, in their absurd way, helped to shape the destinies of the king's own children. It is one of the small, bitter jokes of history that this man, the loser in every reckoning, the cuckold of the antlered carriage, the exile brooding among his vines, in fact won the longest game of all, for he outlived his triumphant wife by a dozen years and more, dying an old man in his southern country long after she was dust, the lawful widower of a woman the world remembered as the king's. He never remarried, never relented, never once acknowledged the long usurpation, and styled himself to the end the husband of the Marquise de Montespan, as though the king and the splendour and the royal children had been a passing impertinence that did not touch the bedrock fact of the sacrament. There was a kind of grim Gascon grandeur in it, this refusal to be bought or to be reconciled, this holding to a ruined honour through 40 stubborn years. The palace had laughed at him, and the king had broken him, and the cynics had reckoned him a fool for not pocketing his shame and the pensions it would have earned. But he kept the one thing they could not take, which was the right to say that he had never agreed, and he carried it to his grave like a banner, the wronged husband who would not be made complacent. That one man at that whole vast court who had told the Sun King no, with the Marquis banished to the south, and the gentle rival shut away in her Carmel, Athenais de Montespan stood at last precisely where she had always meant from her girlhood to stand, alone and supreme at the very summit of the court, the openly acknowledged favourite of the greatest king in all of Christendom. And now we come to the long decade of her glory, the dazzling years when she was, in everything but the empty name, the true Queen of France. Let me show you what that glory looked like from within, for it was a thing whose like has rarely been seen on this earth. She was given a suite of apartments at the very heart of the palace, finer and far larger than those of the Queen herself, a thing that the whole court noted, and that the poor Queen felt as a daily wound. When Marie-Thérèse made do with a modest establishment, Madame de Montespan commanded a great sweep of chambers, 20 of them by some accounts, hung with damask and crowded with treasures, set conveniently upon the ground floor, with the gardens at the long windows, exactly where a king passing to or from the hunt might most easily find his way to her. And there she held a court within the court. The ministers came to her there, and the ambassadors and the envoys and the suitors after office and pension and favour, all the vast hungry traffic of a kingdom in which nothing whatever could be won except through the king's regard, and the king's regard could so very often be reached most smoothly through the marquise's drawing room. She was clever enough to wield this power, and clever enough, for the most part, to veil how much of it she wielded, and for a decade together, a great deal of the soft, unofficial business of France passed through that beautiful sunlit suite of rooms. A morning there would show you the whole soft machinery of her power at work. The marquise would receive while her hair was being dressed, that long and elaborate ritual of curling and powdering and pinning that filled the first hours of a great lady's day, and as the maids laboured over the famous fair curls the chamber would fill with petitioners, with a bishop hoping for a richer see, a colonel hoping for a regiment, a mother hoping to place a plain daughter among the Queen's attendants, a poet hoping for a pension, a financier hoping for a contract to farm the King's taxes. To each she gave a word, a promise, a cool refusal wrapped in a compliment, a flash of the Mortemart wit that sent them away laughing, even when she had given them nothing. She knew, none better, that her influence was a currency that lost its value the moment it was seen to be spent in vain, and so she hoarded it and dealt it out with care, and everyone understood that a request granted in that sunlit room was as good as granted by the king himself. For what she asked of him in the warm privacy of the evening, he very seldom refused her. So the great traffic of ambition flowed to her door, and she sat at the centre of it like a spider at the heart of a golden web, and felt, for a decade, the whole weight of the kingdom lean gently and continually upon her favour, and she was magnificent to look upon, and she dressed with a daring and an invention that set the fashion for the whole of Europe to copy. She wore her fair hair in a great artful riot of curls. She draped her tall figure in cloth of gold and cloth of silver, and in jewels that were the wonder of the court. And even as she bore the king child after child, she carried her ripening fullness with so queenly an assurance that she turned her very thickening into a style, inventing the loose flowing gown that the court called the robe battante, which both flattered and concealed a swelling waist, so that the ladies of France hurried to wear it whether they had her reasons or not. She was painted again and again by the finest hands, reclining as a goddess among cupids and fountains and clouds, the very deity of the new and rising Versailles. The painters of the royal household delighted in her, for she gave them a subject worthy of their grandest manner, and they set her amid all the apparatus of mythology, half draped in shimmering silks, attended by little winged loves, framed by columns and falling water and the rich dim gold of a palace interior. In one celebrated portrait she lies at her ease upon a couch in a great vaulted room, her children playing about her, the whole composition a hymn to fruitfulness and luxury and ease, the mistress as earth goddess surrounded by the abundance she has brought forth. These images were not private keepsakes but public statements, hung where they would be seen, copied and engraved and sent abroad, part of the great machine of display by which Versailles announced itself to the world, and they fixed the marquise in the imagination of Europe as the type and summit of a certain kind of magnificent worldly womanhood. It is worth remembering, when we come to her grey penitent years, that this was how she had been taught to see herself and to be seen as a goddess among goddesses, and how very far she would have to fall before she could kneel. To the foreign visitor she was at once the most striking and the most dreaded woman in the kingdom, for the dazzling beauty came wrapped about that famous Mortemart tongue, and the tongue by now had grown more dangerous than any beauty. She could ruin a reputation with a single murmured phrase across a card table, and the great ones of that world trembled to find themselves its target even as they wept with laughter when it was turned upon some other unlucky soul. She was, in these years, the absolute mistress of the most magnificent court on the earth, and she knew it to her fingertips, and she meant the whole watching world to know it too. And all the while the true queen looked on Marie-Thérèse, who outranked the marquise as heaven, outranks earth in the cold grammar of precedence, was made to feel at every hour of every day how little that empty rank availed her against the warm reality of the king's desire. She must watch the mistress take the better rooms, the better place in the coach, the better light at the card table, the king's arm and the king's ear, and the king's evenings. She must be civil, for the king required it, and she was civil, with the patient wounded dignity that was the only revenge left to her. There is a story that she said once, of the marquise, that the woman would be the death of her, and another that she came in her later years to a strange weary fondness for the rival who had supplanted her, the two of them bound together in the long captivity of a court where neither could leave, and both must smile. Whether the queen hated or forgave, it made no difference to her standing, for she was the wife and the Marquise was the beloved, and in the world of the Sun King, the second of those was worth 100 of the first. To prove how wholly she ruled his heart, the king was about to raise for her a palace of her very own. The palace was called Clagny, and its building tells you more about the king's passion for the Marquise than any letter or memoir could. It stood just outside the gates of Versailles, on low ground near a marshy pond, and the king resolved that his mistress should have there a country house worthy of a queen. He gave the work to the greatest architect of the age, Jules Hardouin Mansart, the man who would go on to raise the vast garden front of Versailles itself and the dome of the Invalides over Paris. The first plans were not grand enough for Athenais, who looked at them and is said to have remarked with the lethal Mortemart lightness that they would do very well for an opera singer. The king tore them up and ordered something far greater, and what rose at Clagny was a true chateau, a long noble pile of golden stone with wings and a central dome, set in gardens that ran down to the water. At Clagny the architect had a freer hand and a single mistress to please, and he raised for her a house of honey-coloured stone in the grand classical manner, a long central block crowned with a cupola, and reaching out on either side in curved colonnaded wings, so that the whole composition seemed to open its arms to the gardens spread before it. It was a design at once severe and welcoming, the geometry of the new French taste softened by the sweep of those embracing arcades. There were great rooms for receiving and small ones for retiring, a chapel, a gallery, staircases of marble, ceilings painted with the gods and graces among whom the Marquise liked to imagine herself numbered. It was not a villa nor a hunting box, but a true palace in little, a sovereign's house in everything but the name, and it announced to every eye that beheld it that the woman who lived there was loved as queens are seldom loved and housed as mistresses had never been housed before. The making of it was a marvel and a scandal at once. 1,200 workmen, by the contemporary accounts, swarmed over the site, and the cost ran to sums that made even that lavish court catch its breath. The gardens were laid out by André Le Nôtre, the same genius who had drawn the immortal vistas of Versailles, and he gave Clagny an orangery and parterres and a great wood, and a flower garden so abundant that it was kept stocked, season upon season, from beds of blooms grown elsewhere and carried in already flowering, so that the Marquise should never look out upon bare earth. There were tuberoses by the thousand, whose heavy perfume hung over the whole estate on a warm night so thickly that visitors said it could make the head swim. There was a dairy and a menagerie and a model farm with cows and doves, a toy of rural innocence built at vast expense for a woman who was the least innocent creature at court. The cost of the place became a byword, whispered of with that mixture of awe and disapproval the very rich always provoke, and the sums named in the telling grew with each retelling until Clagny stood in the public imagination as a kind of monument to royal extravagance, a king's ransom in stone raised for a king's pleasure. Sober men shook their heads over it, thinking of the taxes wrung from the provinces and the soldiers unpaid, and saw in the Marquise's golden palace a sign of the times, of a reign that had begun to mistake magnificence for greatness. But the Marquise heard none of this, or heeded none of it, for she had what she wanted, a house worthy of her blood and her ambition, and she filled it and adorned it, and held court in it, as though it were no more than her due, which, in her own unshakable estimation, it was, to stand in those gardens on a summer evening, with the light going gold over the clipped hedges and the long water lying still as glass. It was to understand what wealth could do when it was poured out without limit upon a single human pleasure. The parterres were embroidered in box and coloured gravel into patterns as intricate as lace. The orangery-sheltered trees in great silver tubs that were wheeled out to scent the terraces in the warm months and wheeled back under glass at the first frost. Beyond the formal gardens lay a wood cut through with shaded alleys for walking in the heat of the day, and beyond that the model farm, with its dairy and its dovecote and its sleek improbable cows, a pastoral toy where a great lady might play at the simple life for an afternoon before returning to her marble rooms. Le Nôtre, who had taught the very earth at Versailles to lie down in straight lines and rise up in fountains at the king's command, gave Clagny the same disciplined enchantment in smaller compass, and the Marquise, who loved flowers as she loved all beautiful things, walked there among her tuberoses and her orange blossom like a goddess in a garden made for her alone. To walk through Clagny in its glory was to walk through the very embodiment of the king's favour made visible in stone and water and growing flowers. It said, more loudly than any patent of nobility, that this woman was loved by the master of France, that no expense was too great for her, that she stood above the ordinary rules of fortune. The court understood the message perfectly. So did the foreign ambassadors, who reported it home to their masters as a sign of where true power at court now lay, and so did the Queen, who could not help but measure her own modest establishment against the rising palace of her rival, and who bore the comparison, as she bore everything, with a patient, wounded silence that did her great credit, and won her not the smallest advantage. For the Marquise, Clagny was both a triumph, and in a quiet way, a sign of things to come, though she did not read it so. A house is a permanent thing, and permanence was exactly what her position lacked. She reigned by the king's desire, and desire is the most fleeting of all human goods. The palace would stand long after the love that built it had cooled, a beautiful and slightly melancholy monument to a passion that, like all passions, was already, at its very height, beginning imperceptibly to fade. But that is a thought for later, and there is a final irony in the stone of it that we may as well note here, since we shall not pass this way again. The great palace that the king raised for his mistress, that cost a fortune and swallowed the labour of 1,200 men, that was meant to stand as a monument to a love beyond the reach of time, did not in the end outlast by very much the dynasty that built it. Within 100 years of its raising, it was reckoned an inconvenient old pile, fallen out of fashion and out of use, and it was pulled down, its golden stone carted away, its gardens ploughed under, until not one wing of it remained above the ground. The tuberoses are gone, the fountains are dry, the painted goddesses have crumbled, and where the most envied private house in France once stood there, is nothing now to tell the passer-by that here a king once housed the woman he loved, as queens are seldom loved. So much for monuments. The verses she protected outlasted her palace, as we shall see, and that is a lesson in where true permanence is to be found, though it was not a lesson the Marquise, in her glory, was in any mood to learn. In the years of glory, Clagny was simply the most envied private house in France, and its mistress filled it not only with treasures, but with something rarer and more lasting than treasure. She filled it with genius. For this is the side of Athenais de Montespan that her enemies, then and since, have been least willing to grant her, and it is the side that does her the most honour. She was a woman of genuine and discerning taste, and she used her position and her purse to become one of the great patrons of the most glorious age of French letters. The Mortemart wit that could destroy a reputation could also recognise a masterpiece, and she recognised them by the handful, in an age that was producing them by the handful. The writers of the grand cycle, the giants whose works are still the glory of the French language, found in the Marquise a protector who understood them. She befriended and supported Jean Racine, the supreme tragic poet of the age, whose verse has a music that has never been surpassed in French. She championed the fabulist Jean de La Fontaine, whose sly and tender animal fables every French child still learns, and who needed protectors badly, for he was improvident and out of favour and forever in want of a patron's roof. She admired the critic and poet Nicolas Boileau, the lawgiver of French taste. She delighted in the operas of Lully, set to the words of the poet Quinault, the gorgeous musical spectacles that were the newest wonder of that world. She read deeply and judged shrewdly, and a word of praise from the marquise could lift a struggling writer into the sunlight of fashion, while her scorn could leave a pretentious one in the cold. Her drawing-room, at the palace and at Clagny, became a place where the most brilliant minds in France gathered to talk and to shine, and the talk there, lit by that famous wit, was reckoned the best in the kingdom. Consider what it meant, in that age, to have the marquise for a friend. Jean Racine, whose tragedies wring the heart with a music no later French poet has matched, was a man of obscure birth and prickly temper, who had risen by sheer genius into the dangerous sunlight of the court, and the protection of a great lady was armour to him against the envy his success bred. She understood his art, which is rarer than admiring it, and could speak of it with a discernment that flattered him more than any pension, weighing a line or a turn of phrase with the sure ear of one who might, in another life and another station, have been a poet herself. The fabulist Jean de La Fontaine she protected at a moment when he badly needed protecting, for he had been the client of a fallen minister, and lay under the shadow of the king's displeasure, improvident, unworldly, forever in want of a roof and a dinner, the most lovable and least practical of men. The marquise, and more particularly her sister, the witty Madame de Thianges, gathered such men about them, and gave them shelter and an audience and the warmth of intelligent company, and in return the writers gave the Mortemart circle the one thing wealth cannot buy, which is to be remembered, for a verse outlasts a palace. What set her apart from the common run of wealthy patrons was that she gave the writers not only her purse but her understanding, and writers will forgive much to be truly understood. She could follow a difficult argument, relish a daring image, and catch the flaw in a weak line, and her praise was therefore worth having in a way that mere flattery from a great lady never is. The poets came to her not as beggars to a patroness, but as craftsmen to a fellow judge of their craft, and that is the rarest and most flattering kind of protection a writer can be given. Her taste reached beyond the printed page to the living arts of the stage and the concert, which in that age were rising to a glory they had never known in France. The theatre was the great passion of the court, comedy and tragedy alike, and the marquise was among the most discerning of its patrons, quick to praise a fine performance and merciless toward a feeble one, her verdict carrying weight because it was known to be honest and informed. She followed the careers of the great players, she attended the first nights, she could discuss a tragedy's construction with its author as an equal, and in music she was no less engaged, for these were the years when French opera was being born, a gorgeous new marriage of song and dance and spectacle and machinery, and the marquise sat through those long enchanted evenings as one of the keenest judges in the land. To preside over such an age, to lend it her purse and her protection, and her unerring eye was no small thing, and it places her, whatever else she was, among the makers, and not merely the spenders of the grand cycle. Between her and the formidable critic Boileau, there ran a kind of alliance, the poet of strict rules and the lady of free wit, and the two of them ruled between them a great swathe of the literary weather of the age. And she was herself, though she wrote nothing for the world to keep, an artist in her own medium, which was talk, and the talk of the Mortemarts was reckoned a kind of literature that died with the speaking, a fountain of phrase and irony and exact devastating observation that those who heard it remembered all their lives and tried, always failing, to set down on paper afterward. The age that produced Racine and Molière and La Fontaine recognized in the Marquise's tongue a gift of the same family, undisciplined and unrecorded, but unmistakably of the first rank, and it is one more reason to grant her, whatever her sins, a true place among the makers of that golden century rather than merely among its scandals. It is one of the kinder ironies of her story that the woman remembered chiefly for scandal and poison was also, in plain fact, one of the truest friends the literature of her century ever had. The fables and the tragedies and the operas she helped to nurture have outlived every quarrel of the court, every intrigue and humiliation, every fortune raised and ruined. Long after the last courtier who feared her tongue was dust, the verses she protected were still being spoken aloud by people who had never heard her name. There is a kind of immortality in that, quite separate from the dark immortality the poison trials would later thrust upon her, and it is only just that we should pause and grant it to her before we go on. The court did not live by letters alone. It lived above all by spectacle, and the spectacles of Versailles in these years were the most extravagant the world had ever witnessed. Let me take you to one of the great fêtes. The great festivals of Versailles in the years of the Marquis's reign were unlike anything Europe had seen since the empire of the Caesars, and they were staged, in no small part, as the settings in which she might shine. The king used spectacle as a tool of rule. By gathering his nobles to marvel together at his magnificence, he bound them to him and reminded them, in the gentlest and most overwhelming way, that he was the source of all delight, as he was the source of all favour. And the Marquise, presiding at his side in the years before the Queen's establishment formally absorbed her, was the radiant centre of these enchantments, the goddess for whom the gardens themselves seemed lit. Imagine the most famous of them, the great divertissement of a high summer, when the whole court was led out into the gardens after the heat of the day had passed. The avenues were lined with thousands of candles set in crystal and in coloured glass, so that the ruled paths ran away into the dusk as rivers of trembling light. In the groves, hidden among the clipped hornbeam and the marble, were laid tables heaped with fruit and ices, and sugared marvels, pyramids of oranges and pomegranates, fountains that ran not with water but with wine. There was music everywhere, drifting from among the trees, the violins of Lully's band placed in the bosquets, so that the melody seemed to rise from the garden itself. The company walked among all this in their silks and their jewels, and the jewels answered the candlelight, and the Marquise walked at the heart of it, the most jewelled and the most watched of all. The king staged several of these great entertainments in the years of her ascendancy, and one in particular, mounted to celebrate a swift summer conquest, fixed itself in the memory of all who saw it as the high-water mark of courtly splendour. The whole company was led from station to station through the gardens, as through the acts of a play, pausing at one grove for a comedy of Molière, at another for a banquet laid out amid the fountains, at a third for a ballet danced upon the grass by torchlight, the king himself in his younger years dancing amid the gods and shepherds, for he was a fine dancer and loved to be seen as the very sun whose emblem he had taken. Each scene was more lavish than the last, and the cost of a single night of it would have kept a regiment in the field for a season, and the Marquise moved through all of it as the presiding deity, the woman for whose delight everyone present was meant to understand. This paradise had been conjured out of marsh and money. Then would come the play, an evening of Molière or of Racine, performed on a stage built among the fountains, with the spray catching the torchlight behind the actors, and after the play, the supper, served in a great open-air room of greenery and light, hundreds at the tables and the king moving among them, gracious and remote, and at the very last, when full dark had come, fireworks. Versailles in those nights blazed against the sky, in a way that made the watching ambassadors grope for words to describe it to their distant courts. Rockets climbed and burst over the long canal and were answered by their own reflections in the black water below, so that the heavens and the earth alike seemed to catch fire. The king's monogram, the great double L, hung in flame above the palace. The whole vast garden became for an hour a vision of paradise built by human hands, and the woman in whose honour so much of it was contrived stood and watched the light fall and rise, and was, in that hour, as near to a goddess as a mortal woman has ever been allowed to come. On the great canal that Le Notre had drawn across the gardens, the king kept a small fleet of pleasure boats, among them gondolas sent as a gift by the Republic of Venice, with their own gondoliers brought from the lagoon to row them, so that on a warm night the court might drift upon the dark water with music going before them in another boat, and the lit windows of the palace doubled in the ripples. It was all of it a kind of statecraft, though it wore the mask of mere amusement, for the king had understood, as few rulers ever understand, that men are governed as much by wonder as by fear, and that a nobility kept dazzled and entertained and competing for invitations to such nights as these was a nobility too charmed and too busy to plot rebellion in its provinces. The marquise was the brightest jewel in this long calculated enchantment, and she knew it, and she gloried in it, and she did not yet suspect how brief the enchantment of any single woman must be in a place built upon the endless appetite for novelty. Behind all the magic laboured an unseen army, the gardeners and cooks and carpenters and the gunners of the fireworks who built each paradise and swept it away again before the dawn. For the whole art of the thing was to hide the labour and show only the wonder. Each of these nights consumed a fortune in wax and powder, and sober men reckoned the cost against the taxes wrung from the provinces and shook their heads. But the onlookers saw only the effortless splendour, the gardens that bloomed with light at a wave of the king's hand, and that was exactly as the king intended, for he meant his power to seem as natural and as boundless as the sun he had taken for his device. The marquise at the heart of it believed, as everyone there believed, that it would last forever, because it was impossible, in that blaze of light, to picture the dark ever coming back. Nor were the enchantments only of the summer and the open air. Through the long winters the courtiers amused themselves indoors, in the great lit galleries, with what came to be called the evenings of the apartments, when the king threw open his staterooms and his courtiers gathered to dance and to hear music, and above all to gamble, for the play at those tables ran deep and ruinous, fortunes changing hands across an evening at cards or at the dice, while the candles burned down and the losers smiled their careful smiles. The marquise loved the play, loved the risk and the glitter of it, and lost and won at the tables with the same Mortemart insouciance she brought to everything, and a wicked phrase let fall over a losing hand could undo a rival as surely as any plot. These winter evenings were a court within that larger world, governed by their own subtle etiquette, and the marquise in her years of power was their sun, as she was the sun of the summer gardens, the one fixed point about which the whole brilliant, restless gathering arranged itself. It was in these years, too, that the sovereign made the fateful decision to fix his wandering household in one place forever. In the year 1682, he declared the great palace in the western marshes the permanent seat of his government, and the whole apparatus of the state, the ministries and the archives and the thousands of officials and servants who made the machine of monarchy turn, settled there at last. The endless travelling between the old houses was over. Henceforth the sovereign and his nobles and his clerks would live together under one vast roof in a town of marble grown up out of a hunting lodge, and the splendour she had helped to inaugurate became the fixed and dazzling centre of France. Athenais had reigned over the most magnificent household on earth, while it was still half a thing of tents and journeys, and now it had hardened into a capital of stone, and she was its uncrowned queen. These were the years she would look back on, in her bitter penance, as the high noon of her life. She had everything that ambition could desire. She had the love, or at least the desire, of the greatest king in the world. She had wealth past counting, a palace of her own, the homage of a kingdom, the friendship of genius, and a beauty still in its full ripe summer. She had only to enter a room and the room rearranged itself around her. And she had growing up about her in secret, and then in dazzling acknowledgment, a brood of royal children whom the king meant to lift to the very steps of the throne. Those children, and the strange concealed manner of their coming, are the next part of the story, and they will lead us, by a path she never foresaw, toward the woman who would one day take everything from her. There were, in the end, 7 children of the king and the marquise, born across the long years of their attachment, though not all of them lived. And because of the awkward, unbudging fact of the exiled husband, who might at law claim any child his wife bore, the earlier births were swathed in a secrecy worthy of a conspiracy of state. The marquise would conceal her condition beneath the famous flowing gowns until the last possible hour. When her time came, the child would be carried away at once in the deepest privacy, to be raised in hiding by a trusted woman far from the eyes of the court, under a false name, its royal blood a guarded secret. The king visited these hidden nurseries by night, in disguise, the master of France creeping like a thief to look upon his own children. It is one of the strangest pictures the reign affords, all that majesty reduced to stealth by the obstinacy of a wronged Gascon 500 miles away. The concealment was a constant, nerve-stretching performance, and it produced scenes that would be comic were they not so strange. The marquise, swelling with a royal child, must appear at court and at the great occasions in her flowing gowns, dancing and gaming and presiding, as though nothing were amiss, while a trusted few held their breath. When her hour drew near, she would withdraw on some pretext. The birth would be got through in the deepest secrecy, and the infant spirited away wrapped and hidden, to be handed to the waiting governess, and borne off to its concealed house. Within days the marquise must be back, laced once more into her splendour, betraying nothing. That she carried off this deception not once but again and again, through pregnancy after pregnancy, is a measure of her iron nerve and her command of appearances, and a measure too of the strange world she lived in, where the King of France must smuggle his own children into the world for fear of a Gascon's claim. Of the 7, several were carried off by the illnesses that thinned every nursery of the age, royal or common, and did not live to know what they were. But those who survived the dangerous early years, the king raised to glittering heights. The eldest of the survivors became the Duc du Maine, a clever, charming, lame little boy, lamed by some illness of childhood, whom his father loved beyond all reason and all wisdom, and whom he would strive for the rest of his life to push toward the very steps of the throne. There was the Comte de Toulouse, steady and well-liked, who would serve as an admiral of France. And there were the daughters, raised in their legitimized splendour, and married with their royal bastard blood into the first houses of the kingdom, one of them to the head of the proud house of Condé, and another, in the fullness of time, to the king's own nephew, the Duc de Chartres, who would one day rule France as regent for a child king. Through these marriages, the blood of the marquise flowed into the highest veins of the realm, and her descendants would sit among the princes of the blood, so that the provincial girl from Poitou became, by way of the king's bed, an ancestress of kings. The woman chosen to raise these secret children in their hidden house was a widow of good family and no fortune, a sensible, devout, discreet, and highly intelligent person named Francoise d'Aubigné, the widow Scarron, of whom we shall hear a very great deal. For now, mark only, that she did her difficult work superbly. She loved the children, guarded their secret, nursed them through the frequent illnesses of that age of high infant mortality, and asked little for herself. And in doing so she came, quietly and inevitably, into the orbit of the king. In time the secrecy could be set aside. As the children grew, and as the king's power grew with them, he resolved to bring them out of the shadows and give them the standing he intended for them. By a solemn act, registered by the parliaments and bending the whole apparatus of the law to the royal will, the children were legitimised, declared the king's own, and given great names and greater fortunes, and the act was a strange one, almost without precedent in its boldness, for it raised children born of double adultery. The king married, and their mother married, to a rank just below the princes of the blood themselves. The old nobility murmured at it, and the legitimate princes resented it bitterly, foreseeing the day, which would in fact come, when these bastards raised so high might press their claims against the true line. But the king's will was law, and his love for these children, and above all for the lame eldest boy, brooked no opposition, and so the second family rose, a glittering shadow dynasty set up beside the lawful one. The marquise was now not merely the king's mistress, but the mother of princes, and her position grew thereby both grander and stranger, more exalted and more entangled. And the whole arrangement had brought into her household, by the side door of the secret nursery, the one person in all France who would prove her match. Let us turn to that quiet governess now. Françoise d'Aubigné, the widow Scarron, had a history as strange in its way as the marquise's own, though it ran in the opposite direction, up from the depths rather than down from the heights. She had been born in a prison, the granddaughter of a famous Protestant poet, the child of a feckless father who had fallen foul of the law. Her early years were a chronicle of poverty and dependence, of being passed from relative to relative, of a spell in the West Indies, and a return to France with nothing. She had been received for a time into the Catholic faith and out of the Protestant one, and she had married, young and without love, a witty crippled poet named Paul Scarron, a man much older than herself, famous in the salons of Paris for his comic verse and his grotesque deformities. He gave her a name, an entry into the literary world, and when he died, a widowhood as penniless as her girlhood had been. So the widow Scarron lived for years on the edge of genteel poverty, clever, devout, beautifully mannered, surviving on a small pension and the kindness of patrons, a woman whom everyone respected and no one could quite place. Yet she was no mere poor relation haunting other people's drawing rooms, for she had a gift that the age prized above almost any other, the gift of conversation, and in the salons of Paris, where she was received, she was valued for a wit that was never cruel, a judgment that was always sound, and a manner of grave and graceful attention that made the person she spoke with feel cleverer and better than before. She had read widely in her hard years, she had thought, she had suffered, and it had given her a depth that the brilliant chatter of the court could not match. Men and women alike sought her out and trusted her with their troubles, for she kept a confidence as few at that court could keep one, and the reputation she built in those obscure years, the reputation of a wise, discreet, and virtuous woman, were the true foundation of everything that came after. She had nothing else, no money, no rank, no beauty of the dazzling kind, but she had made herself by patience and intelligence into a person whom the powerful found it restful and useful to know. And it was in this condition, needing employment and discretion in equal measure, that she was recommended to the marquise as the very person to take charge of the secret royal children. The two women knew each other already, slightly, from the salons. The marquise, who had a sharp eye for ability, saw at once that the grave widow was exactly what the delicate task required, and engaged her. It was, by every worldly measure, an act of patronage, the great lady lifting the poor one out of obscurity. Neither woman can have guessed that the Marquise was, with her own hand, installing her successor, one. For the widow Scarron did her work so well that she made herself indispensable. And indispensability, at that court, was the seed of power. She nursed the little Duc de Maine through a grave illness with a devotion that touched the king to the heart. He had begun by disliking her, finding her stiff and over-pious, calling her a wit and a bel esprit in the dismissive way of a man who distrusts cleverness in a woman who is not amusing him. But the children loved her, and they thrived under her care, and the king came by slow degrees to see in her qualities that the dazzling Marquise conspicuously lacked. Where the Marquise was brilliant, the widow was restful. Where the Marquise was tempestuous, the governess was calm. Where the Marquise' wit cut, the widow's conversation soothed. The king, aging now, and growing year by year more grave, more weary of storms, more troubled in his conscience, found that he liked to talk to her. There was, beneath the magnificence of Louis, a deeply anxious soul, a man who believed without question in heaven and hell and judgment, and who knew with terrible clearness that he had spent his manhood in mortal sin, in adultery doubled and trebled, and who, as he aged, began to feel the cold breath of accounting upon his neck. The widow understood this fear as the brilliant Marquise never could, for the Marquise was part of the sin, and the widow stood outside it, devout and pure and full of the consolations of religion, and she spoke to the king of his soul and his duty in a voice that soothed even as it admonished. She did not scold, and she did not flatter. She listened, and she counselled, and she let him feel that here at last was a companion who wanted nothing from him but his salvation, and to a man frightened for his soul, and surrounded by people who wanted everything from him, that was a rarer and more precious thing than beauty or wit. So the bond between them deepened, evening by quiet evening, while the Marquise raged and dazzled in her great apartments, and never understood that the war was already being lost in a quieter room down the corridor. He rewarded her, as he rewarded those he favoured, with money, and with the money she bought an estate called Maintenon, and he raised the estate to a marquisate, and so the penniless Scarron became, by the king's gift, the Marquise de Maintenon. The Marquise of Glory had a new neighbour at the summit, a quiet, watchful, devout woman, who owed her rise to the king and her opportunity to the very mistress she was, with infinite slowness and infinite tact, but beginning to replace. There is a strange symmetry in the two of them, the two Francoises, that the courtiers must have relished even as they dared not speak of it. One was born to one of the proudest names in France, and spent her gifts climbing into the king's bed and the world's scandal. The other was born in a prison to nothing and nobody, and spent her gifts climbing, by way of virtue and patience, into the king's confidence, and at last his marriage. The brilliant one had begun at the top, and was descending. The grave one had begun at the bottom, and was rising. And the Marquise had set the whole machinery of the second woman's ascent motion with her own hand, by choosing her of all the women in France to raise the children whose nursery would become the antechamber to the throne. For her part, the widow seems to have regarded her own astonishing rise with a grave and watchful humility, as the working of Providence rather than of her own ambition, and whether that humility was wholly sincere or partly a mask, it had served her far better than all the Marquise's dazzle, for the world forgives much to those who appear to want nothing. The two women, who had been something like friends, became rivals, and then enemies, and the enmity was the more dangerous for being so perfectly concealed beneath the forms of courtesy. The Marquise, sensing the danger too late, turned her famous wit upon Maintenon, and found, to her fury, that wit slid off that grave devotion like water off stone, You cannot wound with a clever phrase a woman who has decided to be a saint. There was a peculiar agony in it for the Marquise, who had spent her whole life winning every battle of the drawing-room with a single murmured sentence, to discover at last an opponent her weapons could not touch. She mocked the widow's piety, and the widow only prayed for her. She mimicked the widow's careful manner, and the widow only smiled and was patient. Every shaft the Marquise loosed fell harmless, and worse than harmless, for each one made the Marquise seem the spiteful aggressor and the governess the meek and injured party, and so the very brilliance that had built the Marquise's power now began, in this one fatal contest, to dismantle it. She had met the one person in all that world who could not be dazzled, frightened, or amused into submission, and she did not know what to do, and the not knowing was itself a kind of defeat. But all this lay a little ahead. Before the eclipse came the strange high summer in which the Marquise's domination of the court reached its fullest and most public form, the years when the king travelled with what the courtiers called, half in jest and half in awe, his 3 queens. Let me show you that extraordinary arrangement, for nothing illustrates the Marquis's position better. When the king moved between his palaces, or rode out on campaign, or progressed through his kingdom, he travelled in state, and in the same great coach with him there often rode 3 women, and the courtiers learned to read the meaning of that coach as one reads a coat of arms. There was the queen, Marie-Thérèse, his wife, gentle and unregarded, keeping her dignity and her sorrow to herself. There was in the earlier years La Vallière, the fading mistress, before she fled to her convent. And there was the Marquise, the reigning favourite, blazing with confidence and beauty, the true centre of the king's attention, though the lowest of the 3 in formal rank. 3 women in one coach, the wife, the old love, and the new, and the whole of France watching to see how they were placed and how they were treated, and reading in those placements the whole soft politics of the heart of the kingdom. Nothing at that court was without its meaning, and the meanings were minute and merciless. Who might sit in the royal presence, and upon what? A chair with arms, or a chair without, or a mere folding stool, the right to which was fought over like a province? Who entered a door first? Whose hand was taken at the dance? Whose health the king inquired after, and whose he passed by? All of it was scripture to be passed, and the Marquise had made herself fluent in every clause of it, and bent it wherever she could to magnify her own greatness and diminish the rank that should have crushed her. That she, a Marquise, a mere mistress, an adulteress twice over, could ride in the Queen's own coach as an equal, and better was itself a daily marvel and a daily scandal, and Versailles never tired of reading it. To the visiting foreigner the spectacle was almost beyond belief, and the ambassadors who came to Versailles from the more decorous courts of Europe wrote home about it with a mixture of astonishment and disapproval. In their own countries a king's irregularities were kept decently in the shadows. Here they were paraded in the full light of day, ranked and seated, and processed with all the solemn machinery of state, the wife and the mistress travelling as companions, the children of sin raised to be princes, the whole arrangement conducted with a magnificent indifference to the opinion of the world. Some thought it the height of corruption, and some the height of civilization, and perhaps it was both at once, this dazzling shamelessness, this turning of private passion into public ceremony. What no one could deny was the central place of the Marquise in it all, for the eye of every observer, French or foreign, went straight to her, the radiant, imperious woman at the heart of the king's strange domestic theatre, who carried off the impossible role with such assurance that she made it seem, for a few years, the most natural thing in the world. The Marquise carried herself in this strange procession like the queen she was in all but title. She took precedence where she could, demanded the best of everything, and made the real queen feel, with 1,000 subtle wounds, the smallness of her actual power against the greatness of her empty rank. The gentle Marie Thérèse, who might have been forgiven for hating her rival, in fact came in time to a kind of weary Christian acceptance, and even, astonishingly, to a sort of friendship, for the Marquise could be charming to those she had wholly defeated, and the Queen was past the point of being a threat. It was a court without shame and without privacy, where the king's loves were affairs of state, and the women who shared his life travelled together in a single coach for all the world to see. And when that great household moved, it moved like an army or a migration, a vast slow river of carriages and wagons and outriders winding for miles along the dusty roads of France, carrying not only the king and his women and his ministers, but the very furniture of majesty, the beds and the hangings and the plate and the kitchens, so that wherever the king halted for a night a palace might be conjured up about him out of the baggage. The country people came out to line the roads and stare as this glittering procession passed, and somewhere near its heart, in the best coach, among the cushions and the little dogs and the card games that beguiled the tedious hours, rode the Marquise in her glory, looked at by half a kingdom, the provincial girl who had become the wonder and the scandal of France, and at the centre of it, supreme and seemingly unassailable, rode Athenais de Montespan. She had reached the very top. From the very top, the only direction left is down, and the descent, when it began, would begin from within, in the one place where all her brilliance could not help her, in the king's slowly cooling heart and her own slowly rising fear. The cracks, when they came first in the place no architect could mend, in the king's affections, and the Marquise felt them long before anyone else could see them. Arraigning favourite lives by a single thread, the desire of one man, and she had reached the age at which that thread, in the natural course of things, begins to wear. She was past her middle 30s now, then nearing 40, and though she was still a handsome woman, she was no longer the dazzling girl who had charmed the king on the roads to Flanders. The endless childbearing had thickened her figure beyond even the cleverest gown's power to disguise. The famous wit, which had once enchanted the king, now as often as not flayed him, for she had grown imperious and exacting in her security, and she made scenes, and the king above all things hated scenes. He was changing too, and changing away from her. The grave, disciplined boy had become a grave, disciplined man in his middle years, more weighed down by the cares of state and of his soul, more inclined to quiet and to conscience. The courtiers whispered that he wearied of the Marquise's tempers, that her jealousy had become a burden, that he sought elsewhere the restful companionship his aging heart now craved. And he did seek it elsewhere, in a string of lesser attachments that wounded the Marquise to the quick, for a man may keep one mistress in dignity, but he humiliates her when he takes a second beneath her very eyes. The proud woman who had done exactly this to La Vallière now tasted the same medicine, and found it as bitter as she had once made it for another. There was a brief, painful affair with a young noblewoman of the court, and others, fleeting, half-hidden, each a small wound. One was a beautiful princess of the great house of Rohan, whose understanding with the king the whole court read. It was whispered, in a pair of emerald earrings she wore, on the days the king was free to come to her, a signal flag of adultery flown in jewels for the initiated to decipher. Another was a charming girl of the Queen's household, who blazed briefly in the royal favour before she was sent away. Each of these passing fancies the Marquise endured as a fresh humiliation, for they were conducted under her very eyes in the rooms where she still reigned in name, and they told her, and told the watching courtiers, that she no longer held the king's desire to herself, that the great exclusive passion of her glory years had dwindled into one appetite among several. The proud woman who had done exactly this to La Vallière, supplanting her by inches in her own apartments, now tasted the identical medicine, the slow public humiliation of the woman who is kept but no longer cherished, and she found it as bitter as she had once made it for another. The Marquise raged and wept and schemed to keep her place. She used every art she had, the wit, the beauty that remained to her, the long shared history, the bond of the children. She fought, in truth, the way a great power fights a long-losing war, with skill and courage and no real prospect of victory. She made herself indispensable in 100 small ways, the keeper of the king's pleasures, the arranger of his entertainments, the mother of the children he doted on. She raged at her rivals and contrived to have them sent away. She was, by turns, the dazzling companion of his better hours, and the tempestuous scold of his worse ones. And she could never quite govern the temper that did her so much harm, for the very pride that had carried her to the top would not let her stoop to the meek and pleasant submission that might have kept her there a little longer. There were reconciliations, sweet and convincing, followed by fresh quarrels and fresh estrangements, the weary cycle of a love grown old and sour, and through it all the king drew by infinitesimal degrees, further off, until the warmth that had once been the sun of her whole existence was no more than a distant, formal courtesy. And for a while it worked, for the king did not cast her off. He was loyal in his fashion, slow to break with the mother of his cherished bastards, comfortable in the long habit of her, and she remained at court, still grand, still housed in her great apartments, still the official mistress in the eyes of the world. But she knew, a woman as clever as the Marquise could not fail to know that the ground had shifted beneath her, that she reigned now by habit and not by passion, that the king's heart had begun its slow journey away from her, toward she did not yet know whom, and the knowledge frightened her, the way the loss of the one thing we have staked everything upon must always frighten us. The most envied woman in France lay awake in the dark, and was afraid. The fear had more than one root, for it was not only her place she dreaded to lose, but in the small hours when the candles guttered, her very soul. There had already been one great public reckoning over exactly this. Some years before, the preachers and the bishops of France, scandalized that the king lived in open and notorious adultery, had pressed him hard upon the state of his soul, and for a season the king had yielded to their thunder, and he and the Marquise had been made to part, to live separately, and to renounce their sin, with much solemn talk of repentance on both sides. But the parting had not held. They were brought back into one another's company under the watchful eyes of the devout, who fondly imagined the danger past, and the old fire flared up again at once, and the Marquise bore the king yet another child, to the despair of the clergy, and the secret amusement of the cynical court. So she knew, none better, what it was to be separated from the king in the name of religion, and to win him back, and she may well have believed, in her fear, that she could do it once more. The faith of her convent girlhood had never wholly died, and now as the glory cooled and the body aged and the king turned toward the pious widow who spoke to him of heaven, the old grave voice from the choir at Saint-Aise began to make itself heard again beneath the chatter of the court. She knew herself a sinner on a monstrous scale, an adulteress who had shared a wedded king and borne him children in defiance of every law of God, and the church reminded her of it pointedly. For there were confessors brave enough to refuse her absolution while she persisted, turning her from the sacraments at Easter in a public rebuke that stung her pride and frightened her conscience together. So she was assailed on two sides at once, by the loss of the king's love and by the fear of God's judgment, and a woman so beset, proud and frightened, and no longer young, was a woman ripe for desperate remedies. It is here, in this fear, that the shadow falls across her story, the shadow that would in the end all but swallow her. For a frightened woman who has built her whole life upon her power to please, and who feels that power slipping, is one who will look for help wherever help is promised, even in places she would once have scorned. And in the Paris of those years there was no shortage of people promising help for a price in the most desperate matters of the human heart. To understand what the Marquise was accused of doing, and what nearly destroyed her, we have to leave the gilded rooms of Versailles for a while and go down into a very different city, into the back streets and the hidden chambers where another France entirely went about its dark and ancient trade. For beneath the brilliant surface of the King's France there ran a deep underground river of superstition, as old as the kingdom and far older, a world of fortune-tellers and alchemists, of sellers of love powders and of poisons, of renegade priests who would say unholy masses for money, of midwives who dealt in things no midwife should. Paris in particular swarmed with these practitioners of the forbidden, and they were consulted, in secret, by every rank of society, from the poorest washerwoman wanting to know whether her man would return to the greatest ladies of Versailles, wanting to know how to keep a lover, or be rid of a husband or a rival. It is hard now to grasp how thoroughly this shadow trade was woven into the life of that glittering age, but the truth is that a great part of that world, beneath its powder and its piety, believed without much question in philters and fortunes and the dark efficacy of the right powder bought from the right woman in the right back room. The ladies who curtsied so prettily at Mass went veiled by night up the garden paths of the fortune-tellers. The same hands that fingered rosaries crossed the palms of the divineresses with gold. It was an open secret, half believed and half laughed at, and it sat there beneath the surface of Versailles like a cellar of black water beneath a house of mirrors, until the day the floor gave way. At the dark heart of this underworld stood a woman whose name would become a byword for the whole horror, Catherine Monvoisin, known to all Paris as La Voisin. She was, on the surface, a fortune-teller, a reader of palms and faces, a seller of cosmetics and charms, and she ran a flourishing business from her house, receiving a stream of clients who came veiled and hooded up her garden path. But behind the fortune-telling lay a far more sinister trade. La Voisin dealt in love powders meant to inflame a cooling heart, in potions to procure or to prevent a birth, and, it would emerge, in poisons, the so-called inheritance powders, by which an impatient heir or a weary wife might hasten a death and call it nature. She was in league with a circle of renegade priests, who for gold would perform blasphemous rites, the unspeakable ceremonies that rumour called the Black Mass, in which the forms of the holy sacrifice were turned to the service of lust and murder. La Voisin herself was no furtive hag of the gutter, but a prosperous woman of business, grown rich on the fears and longings of her betters. She kept a fine house with a garden, dressed in a celebrated robe of crimson velvet, worked with golden eagles, and counted among her clients, it would later be sworn, duchesses and countesses and the great ladies of Versailles, who arrived after dark in hired coaches with their faces hidden. To one she sold a powder to win a husband back, to another a draught to be rid of an unwanted child, to a third, perhaps, something darker still, a slow, tasteless preparation to clear an inconvenient life out of the way and leave no mark the doctors of the day could read. She was the queen of this hidden Paris, with a web of suppliers and accomplices spread through the city, alchemists and abortionists and unfrocked priests and sellers of dubious drugs, and for years she plied her trade in safety, protected by the very rank of her customers, for who would dare expose a traffic in which half the great names of France were entangled? It was a foul and tangled world, half fraud and half genuine evil, and into it, the investigators would later claim, the threads ran upward, up the social ladder, up and up, until they reached the very apartments of the king's mistress at Versailles. How the law came to pull on those threads, and what unravelled when it did. It's the next dark turn of our story. The scandal that we call the affair of the poisons began, as such things often do, with a single thread that the authorities could not stop pulling. There had been a sensational case a few years before, in which a noblewoman, the Marquise de Brinvilliers, had been found to have poisoned her own father and brothers to gain their fortunes, and had gone to a public execution that fixed the fear of poison in the mind of the whole capital. Her case suggested that the trade in such things was wider than anyone had supposed, and the king's police began to watch. At the head of that police was a formidable man, Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, the first Lieutenant General of Police of Paris, a tireless, incorruptible, and deeply intelligent officer whom the king had set to bring order to the lawless city. It was La Reynie who would follow the threads of the poison trade into places that would make even him recoil. The arrests began, and one informer led to another, and a whole network of fortune-tellers and poisoners and their clients was dragged into the light. La Reynie went about his work with the cold patience of a man unwinding a ball of tangled thread, taking each prisoner's confession and testing it against the next, building from the babble of frightened criminals a slow and terrible picture of an organized trade in death. It grew far beyond anything he or the king had imagined. Hundreds were questioned over the years of the inquiry, scores were imprisoned, and dozens in the end went to the stake or the gallows or the breaking wheel, for the trade proved to reach into every quarter of the city and every rank of society. The interrogations were conducted as the law of the age allowed, under torture, the boot and the water poured down the throat, and confessions wrung out under such agony are a treacherous foundation for any truth, a thing La Reynie himself understood and weighed, even as he was obliged to use them. Yet the sheer accumulation of testimony, prisoner after prisoner, naming the same names, and describing the same horrors without the chance to confer, persuaded the careful officer that beneath the lies and the embroidery there lay a core of dreadful fact. La Voisin herself was taken and questioned, and the things that came out of the interrogations of her circle were so terrible and reached so high that the king resolved to deal with them by an extraordinary tribunal, sitting in secret, outside the ordinary courts, where the most dreadful evidence could be heard without the whole world listening. This tribunal was given a name that has echoed ever since, the Chambre Ardente, the burning chamber, so called because it met in a room hung with black and lit by torches, or perhaps because so many of those it judged were destined for the fire. Before it, over the course of several years, passed a procession of the accused that ran from the gutters of Paris to the antechambers of the palace. What the Chambre Ardente uncovered horrified the age, and horrifies us still. There were poisoners who had dispatched dozens of victims for paying clients. There were the love powders made of revolting ingredients, sold to women desperate to win or hold a man. There were abortions and infanticides, and there were the black masses, the blasphemous rites at which, the witnesses swore, a defrocked priest named Guibourg had performed the ceremony of the altar over the naked body of a living woman, with the chalice resting upon her, invoking demons to grant the petitioner's desire, and at which, in the most dreadful testimony of all, infants were said to have been murdered. How much of this was true? How much the invention of terrified prisoners telling the torturers what they wanted to hear has been argued ever since, and will never be wholly settled. But true or invented, the testimony was sworn and recorded, and some of it named names that made the recording clerks tremble, for the horror did not stay among the poisoners of the back streets. As the confessions multiplied, they began to implicate clients, and the clients were not washerwomen but ladies of fashion, and then ladies of Versailles, and then ladies very close indeed to the king himself. A countess here, a duchess there, names that were spoken every day in the antechambers of Versailles, was suddenly being uttered in the torchlit secrecy of the burning chamber in connection with love powders and poisons and worse. The king watched this rising tide with mounting alarm, for it threatened to engulf his whole court in scandal and to make the most exalted families in France the subject of a criminal inquiry into murder and sacrilege. It was one thing to burn a fortune-teller from the slums. It was quite another to put a duchess to the question. And when at last the confessions began to circle the one name above all others that the king could not allow to be spoken in such a context, that of the mother of his own children, the affair passed beyond a matter of justice and became a matter of the throne itself. La Voisin was condemned. In the early months of the year 1680, she was burned at the stake in a public square of Paris, going to her death, it was said, with a hardened defiance, having lived a life steeped in the trade that now consumed her. Public executions in that age were great spectacles, drawing huge crowds who treated the death of a notorious criminal as both a warning and an entertainment, and the burning of the famous fortune-teller of Paris drew a vast and morbid multitude. She was carried to the place of execution and put to death there before the eyes of the city, and the crowd that had once crept to her door for charms and powders now watched her end with the fascination people reserve for the fall of the wicked. But her burning did not close the affair. The inquiry ground on for years afterward, taking in fresh confessions and fresh prisoners, and the deeper it dug the more uncomfortable the truths it turned up, until the king himself must have wished he had never set his careful policemen to the task, for an investigation begun to protect the public from poisoners had become an investigation that threatened to disgrace the court, and the nearer it crept to the throne, the more plainly it had to be controlled, and then contained, and then, in the end, buried. But she had talked before she died, and her daughter talked after her, and others in the circle talked, and the talk did not stop at the witch's end. It climbed. It named ladies of fashion. It named courtiers. It named, at last, in the testimony of La Voisin's own daughter and of the priest Guibourg, the greatest lady the affair would ever touch. It named the Marquise de Montespan. Here we must be careful, and I will be careful, because this is the heart of the matter, and the place where legend and fact are hardest to part. The accusations against the Marquise came chiefly from a handful of mouths, and it matters who they were. There was La Voisin's own daughter, Marguerite, a young woman who, after her mother went to the fire, poured out before the investigators a flood of detail about the great clients her mother had served, the Marquise foremost among them. There was a sinister magician and confidence man called Lesage, a convicted galley slave with every reason to say whatever might save his neck. And there was most damningly of all, an aged and depraved priest named Guibourg, who confessed to performing the blasphemous rites, and who described, in dreadful particulars, ceremonies said to have been carried out for the Marquise's benefit. These were the witnesses, and not one of them was the kind of person whose unsupported word would hang a beggar in an honest court, let alone a great lady. They were criminals, several of them under sentence of death, all of them desperate, all of them with everything to gain by telling their interrogators what those interrogators half expected to hear. What the witnesses claimed was grave indeed. They said that the Marquise, in the years of her fear, when the king's love was cooling and rivals were rising, had come secretly to La Voisin for help. They said she had bought love powders to be slipped into the king's food, to rekindle his desire and bind him to her. They alleged in the most terrible accusation that she had taken part in the black masses, lying as the altar in those unspeakable rites, and that she had at last, when powders failed, sought to procure a poison to murder the king himself, or the young rival who had supplanted her, rather than be cast aside. These were the charges, sworn before the burning chamber, against the mother of the king's children, the woman who had reigned over his court for more than 10 years. Were they true? We cannot know with certainty, and the honest historian must say so plainly. The witnesses were criminals fighting for their lives, with every reason to embroider, to drag down the great in the hope of mercy or of mere company in ruin. Some of the testimony is self-contradictory, some physically improbable, some clearly the product of fear and torture. It is entirely possible that the Marquise, like half the great ladies of her time, had consulted a fortune-teller and bought a love charm, a thing more foolish than wicked, and that the rest, the masses and the poison, and the plot against the king's life, were the monstrous exaggeration of a poisoned well of testimony. It is also possible that there was a darker truth at the bottom of it. What is certain is that the king believed there was enough in it to terrify him, and that what he did next tells us he could not be sure his children's mother was innocent. Where the careful weighing of probabilities leaves us is somewhere uncomfortably in the middle, which is so often where the truth of such things lies. It seems likely enough, given how common the practice was among the great ladies of her time, that the Marquise did at some point consult the fortune-tellers and buy their love charms, that she did pay for powders meant to rekindle the king's cooling desire and slip them, harmless and useless, into his food, a folly more pathetic than wicked, the act of a frightened woman clutching at any straw. That much fits everything we know of her fear in those years. The graver charges, the black masses and the plot to poison the king or his young rival, stand on far shakier ground, resting on the word of the worst possible witnesses, and may well be the monstrous overcolouring that terror and torture and malice painted upon a foundation of foolish but lesser sin. We shall never know for certain, and anyone who tells you they are sure, either that she was a poisoner or that she was wholly blameless, is telling you more than the evidence allows. The honest verdict is the hardest one, which is that it cannot be settled, and that the woman herself carried the truth of it into the grave. For when the threads reached the Marquise, the king acted to bury them. He had begun the investigation meaning to root out evil without fear or favour, and so long as the accused were fortune-tellers and minor courtiers, he had let the law take its course. But when the testimony touched the woman who had borne his children, whose sons and daughters he had legitimized and meant to raise to greatness, the great machine of justice was quietly halted. Lorraine himself was caught in an impossible position, an honest officer who had followed the evidence to a place no honest officer was meant to go, holding in his careful hands depositions that named the king's own mistress as a would-be poisoner of the king. He could not pursue them, and he could not, in conscience, destroy them, and so he wrote and bound and preserved the most secret papers of the affair, setting down faithfully what had been sworn and waited upon the royal will, and the royal will was that the thing should be smothered. The most dangerous depositions, the ones that named the Marquise, were set aside. The accused who had spoken them were not brought to ordinary trial, where they might repeat their stories in open court, but were shut away instead, some of them for the rest of their lives, in remote fortresses, chained and isolated and forbidden to speak, lest a word of what they knew should ever reach the world. It is one of the quietly terrible details of the whole affair, this fate reserved for those who knew too much. They were not executed, for an execution is a public thing, with a scaffold and a crowd and a confession that any bystander might hear and carry away. They were instead made to vanish, distributed among distant prisons in the far corners of the kingdom, kept apart from one another and from the world, watched by jailers under orders to record anything they let slip and to silence them if they cried out the forbidden names. Some were chained to the walls of their cells. Some lived on in this living burial for decades, growing old and mad in the dark, outlasting the very scandal they had been buried to conceal, until death at last did for them what the king's mercy would not. It was a fate in some ways crueler than the fire, and it was chosen for exactly one reason, that silence in a dungeon is surer than silence on a scaffold, and the king meant to have quiet at any price. The king took the most secret papers of the affair, and years later, with his own hand, is said to have burned them. He would not, could not, let his children be branded the offspring of a poisoner. And so the truth, whatever it was, went into the fire with Lavoison's secrets, and the Marquise was never charged, never tried, never publicly named, but never, in the king's heart, wholly cleared, either. Even as the poison investigation gathered behind the scenes, the Marquise's place in the king's life was being lost in the open to a rival of a sort she could not fight. The rival was very young, very lovely, and almost entirely without sense, and her name was Marie Angelique de Fontainebleau. She came to court a girl of about 18 or 19, fresh from the provinces, with a beauty so radiant that the whole court gasped at it, and a mind so empty that the wits, the Marquise foremost among them, sharpened their cruellest phrases on her. The king, aging and sated with cleverness, fell for that fresh young beauty like a boy. It was, the courtiers agreed, the infatuation of a man who wanted only to be charmed and not challenged, and after the storms of the Marquise it was a holiday for him. The Marquise, who had supplanted the gentle La Vallière by being brilliant, now found herself supplanted in turn by a girl whose only gifts were youth and a face, and the irony of it must have been gall in her mouth. There was a peculiar humiliation in being beaten by a fool. The Marquise had ruled the king's heart for a decade by the sheer force of her mind, her wit, her taste, her conversation, the things that do not fade, and she had told herself, perhaps, that these were her security, that a man might tire of a face, but never of a mind like hers. And now here was the proof that she had deceived herself, for the king had set aside the cleverest woman in France for a girl the Marquise openly dismissed, with the old lethal Mortemart lightness, as a beauty with nothing behind the eyes. The whole court repeated her cruel jokes at the newcomer's expense, and laughed, and went on paying its court to the newcomer all the same, because the newcomer had what the Marquise no longer had, the king's desire. It was a lesson in the brutal simplicity of the thing the Marquise had spent her life mastering, and it cannot have been a comfortable one to learn at past 40, but watching a girl of 18 take the place she had schemed and waited and sacrificed her soul to win. Mademoiselle de Fontainebleau's blazed up brief and bright, like the rockets over the canal, and like them she fell. She left her name to fashion, the high tower of curls and ribbons that the court called the coiffure à la Fontainebleau, after a hunting accident in which her hair came down and she bound it up with a ribbon, and the king admired it. But she had nothing else to give him, no conversation, no companionship for an aging and burdened man, and his fancy for her cooled almost as fast as it had flared. Worse, she bore him a child that did not live, and the birth ruined her health. She sickened, wasted, and within 2 years of her dazzling arrival she was dead, not yet 22, gone from the brilliant court like a candle pinched out. There was a melancholy grandeur in her brief fall. The king, whose fancy had cooled even before her health failed, gave her at the parting the title of Duchess and a great pension, the customary golden handshake of a discarded royal love, and she withdrew from the court. She had so briefly dazzled to an abbey, to be nursed and to die among the nuns. She had risen from nowhere to the summit of the king's favour, and sunk back into the grave in the space of a few short seasons, leaving behind her only a fashion in hair and a sad example of how little, at that court, mere beauty could finally secure. Even the Marquise, who had mocked her without mercy in life, can hardly have rejoiced at so swift and so pitiable an end, for it was a glimpse of the common fate of all the king's women, the gentle and the brilliant and the merely lovely alike, used and raised and set aside, and it cannot have been lost on the Marquise that her own turn at being set aside had already begun. And here the long shadow of the poisons fell once more, For when Mademoiselle de Fontanges died so young and so suddenly, the whisper ran at once through Paris that she had been poisoned, and the whisper named, as the source of the poison, the discarded marquise, eaten with jealousy of the girl who had taken her place. It was said the marquise had reached again to the dark trade that had served her before, and silenced her young rival forever. Almost certainly it was untrue. The poor girl most likely died of the natural complications of a ruined childbed, the commonest of tragedies in that age, and the marquise, whatever her sins, was probably innocent of this one. But she could not prove it, and the rumour clung to her, one more black thread wound about a name already darkening, and the king heard the rumour, and could not be sure, and drew a little further away from the woman his court now half believed a murderess. It was the cruellest of conjunctions, for the two disasters fed upon one another. The poison whispers made the king look upon his old mistress with a new and chilling doubt, and that doubt made it the easier for him to turn from her to the fresh young beauty, and then to the grave devout widow. And the very fact of her being supplanted made the poison whispers the more believable, for a discarded and desperate woman was exactly the sort of creature the public imagined creeping to the fortune-tellers with murder in her heart. Innocence and guilt hardly mattered any longer. What mattered was that the marquise had become, in the king's mind and the court's, a figure of shadow, no longer the dazzling goddess of the fêtes, but something darkened and faintly sinister, a woman it was wiser to keep at a distance. And so, between the girl who took her place and the rumour that blackened her name, the brilliant reign of Madame de Montespan guttered toward its end, and the king's heart, when it was free again, did not come back to her, so the marquise lost the field to the empty-headed Fontanges, and then Fontanges died, and the king's heart, freed again, did not return to its old mistress. It went, instead, where it had long been quietly tending, to the grave and watchful widow who had raised his children, and who now, by patience and piety and the simple refusal ever to make a scene, was gathering into her steady hands everything that the brilliant marquise had let slip from her own. Let us follow that quiet ascent, for it is one of the most remarkable in the history of the French court, and it sealed the marquise's fall. Sire? The Marquise de Maintenon, as the former widow Scarron had become, rose by being everything the king now wanted and the Marquise of Glory was not. She was devout, and the aging king was turning ever more anxiously toward his religion, fearful for a soul stained by a lifetime of adultery. She was calm, and he was weary of tempests. She was wise, discreet, endlessly patient, and she asked nothing for herself, or seemed to ask nothing, which at that court was the subtlest form of asking. She did not seek to be the king's mistress, and indeed by every credible account she never was, for her power lay precisely in her virtue, in being the good woman who would help the king mend his ways, give up his sinful loves, and turn at last to God and to his lawful duty. She became his confidant, his counsellor, the companion of his evenings, the soft voice at his shoulder, and the more she withheld, the more he valued her. There was a great change coming over the king in these years, and Maintenon was both its cause and its chief beneficiary. The pleasure-loving prince of the fêtes and the mistresses was hardening into a grave, devout, almost austere old man who heard mass daily and examined his conscience and set himself to govern his own appetites as sternly as he governed France. The brilliant, sensual, scandalous court of his youth, one the marquise had reigned over, began to fade, and a soberer, more pious, more decorous court took its place, in which open adultery was no longer fashionable but faintly disreputable, and the loudest virtue was the surest road to favour. Maintenon embodied and encouraged this new spirit, and as it spread, the marquise, who was the very emblem of the old order, the living monument of the king's sinful years, became an embarrassment, a relic, a reminder of everything the aging king now wished to forget about himself. The wheel had turned, and the qualities that had raised the Marquise to glory, her boldness, her wit, her magnificent worldliness, were now precisely the qualities the new order frowned upon, while the widow's grave devotion, once so easy to mock, had become the highest card in the pack. Then, in the year 1683, the gentle Queen Marie-Thérèse, who had borne so much in silence, fell ill and died. She had lived unregarded, and she died, it was said, with the simple goodness that had marked her whole obscure and patient life, and the king, who had used her ill in life, wept for her in death, and paid her, too late, the tribute of his grief. Her death changed everything, for it left the king a widower, free at last to marry, and the woman he turned to was not a foreign princess to refresh the alliances of his crown, but the penniless widow who had begun life in a prison and raised his bastards in a hidden house. In a secret ceremony, in the dead of a night not many months after the Queen's death, Louis XIV, the Sun King, the greatest monarch in Europe, married Francoise de Montespan in a union never publicly acknowledged but never seriously doubted, a marriage of the left hand that made the former widow Scarron, in all but title and in all but the eyes of protocol, the true and final queen of his old age. And in that quiet midnight, the long reign of the Marquise of Glory came finally and forever to its end. Nothing could have been further from the dazzle of the Marquise's reign than the manner of this triumph. Where the Marquise had been crowned, in effect, amid fireworks and fountains and the homage of a kingdom, her successor was wed in secret in the dead of night, with no proclamation, no festival, no public honour of any kind, the marriage itself, a thing to be hidden rather than displayed. And yet it was the secret midnight marriage that endured and the blazing public glory that had passed away, as though the very quietness of Maintenon's victory were the proof of its permanence. The Marquise had ruled by being seen, the most looked-at woman in France, and when the looking turned elsewhere her power was gone. Maintenon ruled by being indispensable in private, and private power, it turned out, was the only kind that lasted at that court of shifting public favour. The lesson was written plain in the contrast, for any who cared to read it, between the goddess of the fetes and the grey wife of the shadows. Maintenon would hold her place for more than 30 years, until the king's own death, longer by far than any of the dazzling mistresses who had gone before her, and she held it not by beauty or by passion, but by being indispensable to an old man's peace. The king came to her rooms each evening to work with his ministers and to rest in her company, and she sat with her needlework and her quiet counsel, while the business of Europe was decided across her little table. The uncrowned and unacknowledged Queen of France, the poor widow from the prison who had outlasted them all. She was never proclaimed, never crowned, never seated on a throne or named in a treaty, and to the end the marriage was a thing everyone knew, and no one was permitted to say aloud. She turned her vast quiet power to grave and earnest ends, very different from the dazzle of the Marquise's reign. Her great work and her great love was a school she founded for the daughters of poor noblemen, a place where girls of good blood and no fortune might be raised in piety and learning, and made fit for honourable lives, and she poured herself into it, drawing up its rules, watching over its pupils, retiring to it at last in her own old age. Under her influence the whole tone of Versailles grew sober and devout, the festivals fewer, the laughter quieter, the open scandals hushed. Some mourned the lost brilliance and grumbled that the old king's court had become as dull as a convent, but it suited the aging Louis, weary of his sins and frightened for his soul, and it suited the grave woman at his side, and between them they presided over the long, magnificent, melancholy autumn of the reign, while the bright spring of it, the spring the Marquise had ruled, faded into memory. But she had won, completely and permanently, the long patient war that the brilliant marquise had not even understood. She was fighting until it was already lost. The tortoise had outrun the hare, and the hare was left to watch from the diminished state of her great apartments as the tortoise settled into the place that had once been hers. What followed for the marquise was not a sudden banishment, but something stranger, and in its way, more painful. A long, slow, hollowed out, lingering at the very court where she had once reigned. She was not sent away. The king, who hated open ruptures, and who was bound to her by the children they shared, allowed her to keep her grand apartments and her place, and the outward forms of her old greatness for years after the substance of it had gone. So she remained at Versailles, the deposed favourite, sweeping through the rooms where every soul now knew that her power was broken, keeping her state in a court that had quietly transferred its homage to the silent woman in the king's confidence. It was a curious half-life, a queen without a throne haunting the palace of her own lost glory. There was a peculiar cruelty in the very setting of it, for she was obliged to live out her diminishment in the exact rooms that had witnessed her triumph. Here were the great apartments where ministers had once waited upon her word, now grown quiet, the petitioners thinned to a trickle, and then to none. Here were the galleries down which she had swept in her glory, where now the same courtiers who had bowed lowest hurried past with a hasty civility, their eyes already seeking the favour that lay elsewhere. Every corner of the place held the ghost of what she had been, and she could not turn a corner without meeting it. A kinder fate might have sent her clean away to grieve her losses among strangers in some distant house. Instead, she was left to wander the scene of her greatness, like a ghost who does not yet know she is dead, present at the feast and no longer of it, watching the new reign rise in the very rooms where her own had fallen. The king treated her now with a cold and faultless courtesy that was somehow crueler than any harsh word would have been. He was perfectly civil to her. He saw to her comfort, attended to her children, observed every form, but the warmth was utterly gone, and she felt its absence in every measured, distant exchange. Versailles, ever quick to read the weather of favour, turned from her as a garden turns from a setting sun. The same great ones who had trembled at her wit and crowded her drawing-room and begged her good word now found reasons to be elsewhere, paid their court to Maintenon instead, and left the marquise more and more alone in the splendid rooms that had once been the centre of the kingdom. The famous tongue still flashed, but there were fewer and fewer to flatter it, and the loneliness of those years bit deep into a woman who had lived all her life at the burning centre of every gathering. What sustained her in this long twilight was chiefly her children, the glittering brood she had given the king and seen raised to the steps of the throne. They were grown now, or growing, with their great titles and their great marriages, and through them she kept a thread of connection to the splendour she had lost. She had been a careful and ambitious mother, pressing their fortunes, arranging their matches, and she watched their rise with the fierce possessive pride of a woman who had little else left to be proud of. Yet even here there was a sorrow waiting, for the children belonged to the king and to the court, and the closer they grew to the king, the more they were drawn into the orbit of the very woman who had displaced their mother, for it was Maintenon, the old governess, who had raised them, and whom in some measure they loved. The marquise had to watch her own children pay their court to her supplanter, and to feel in that the last and most intimate turn of the screw, that even the love she had a natural right to was now shared with the rival who had taken everything else. She tried for a long while to hold her ground, out of pride, out of habit, out of love for her children, who were growing up about the court, and whose fortune still bound her to it. But the position became, year by year, less bearable. To stay was to be reminded daily of everything she had lost, to watch her rival rule where she had ruled, to receive the king's icy politeness in the very rooms that had witnessed his passion, and there was, beneath it all, the slow, insistent pull of that other thing, the religion of her convent girlhood, never quite silenced, now growing louder in the quiet that had settled over her life. At last, in the year 1691, more than 20 years after she had first conquered the king's heart on the roads to Flanders, the Marquise de Montespan gathered what remained of her dignity and left the court of Versailles forever. She was past 50. She had reigned and she had fallen, and now she walked out of the palace of her glory into the long, grey, penitential evening of her life. The leaving, when it came, was managed with the cold courtesy that had marked all the king's dealings with her in those last years. She was not driven out with insult, for that was not his way, but she was let understand that her room would not be missed, and arrangements were made, a great pension settled upon her to keep her in the state her birth required, her household disposed of, her departure smoothed. Her own son, the Duc d'Antin, the one child of her lawful marriage, helped to ease her going, a dutiful and worldly man who served the king and managed his difficult mother with tact. She took rooms in Paris, and kept for a while an establishment grand enough for a great lady, and only by slow degrees did she withdraw from the world altogether into the religious life that now claimed her. It was not a flight, and not quite a banishment, but a long-managed retreat, the honourable retirement of a defeated power, and the court she left behind her closed over the space where she had stood as water closes over a stone, and within a season it was almost as though she had never reigned there at all. The world she walked into was very different from the one she left, for the Marquise in her last years became, of all astonishing things, a penitent. The woman who had been the most scandalous in France, who had defied the church and shared a king with his wife and been whispered of in the testimony of poisoners, turned in her later life to a religion, as fierce and as genuine as anything in her stormy nature. It was as though the faith of the convent at Saintes, set aside for 30 years like a letter unopened, had waited all that while, and now came due with interest. She did not do penance by halves, for she did nothing by halves. She gave herself to it with the same fierce energy she had once given to her ambition. She settled much of her time at a convent she had long supported, the community of St. Joseph in Paris, which she had helped to found and endow in her years of wealth, a refuge for poor girls and a house of charity. There she lived a life of devotion that astonished those who remembered the goddess of Clagny. She gave away vast sums to the poor, founding hospitals, relieving the wretched, pouring out in charity the fortune she had gathered in glory. Her penance was not all hair shirts and terror, for there was a real and active goodness in it that does her honour. She took up plain needlework for the poor, the proud hands that had once been kissed by ambassadors now stitching coarse garments for paupers and altar cloths for poor churches. She visited the sick and sat with the dying. She dowered penniless girls so that they might marry or enter religion. She gave with an open hand to every charitable cause that was brought to her, and she did it not for show, for there was no longer any court to applaud her, but out of a genuine and labouring desire to make some amends for the long, brilliant wickedness of her life. The woman who had been the goddess of Clagny became, in these years, a kind of grim ministering angel to the wretched of Paris, and those who received her charity knew nothing and cared nothing for the scandalous greatness of her past, but blessed only the grave, aging, generous lady who came among them with her purse and her needle and her unsmiling kindness. She wore, beneath her fine clothes, garments of penance, rough and galling against the skin, bracelets and girdles set with points that pricked and chafed her, so that she carried her mortification secretly upon her body through her days. She rose in the night to pray. She gave herself to long fasts and long devotions, and all of it was driven, beneath the genuine charity and the genuine faith, by a terror that had taken hold of her and would not let her go. She placed herself under the direction of stern confessors, men who did not flatter her rank or soften their counsel, and who set her hard penances and harder examinations of conscience, and she submitted to them with a humility that would have been unthinkable in the goddess of Clagny. It cannot have come easily, for pride was the deepest thing in her, the very marrow of the Mortemart character, and to kneel and confess and be rebuked and accept the rebuke went against everything her whole life had been. Yet she did it, year upon year, driving herself toward a repentance she could never quite feel she had achieved, for the more she examined her conscience, the more there seemed to answer for. The wrecked lives and the shared king and the children of sin and the long blasphemy of her glory. Some souls find peace in religion. The Marquise found chiefly labour and fear, a ceaseless effort to make her soul acceptable to a God she had spent her best years ignoring, and the effort never brought her the serenity that the gentle Lavalière had found so much more easily, as though the very fierceness she brought to her penance was itself a barrier to the peace it sought. For the Marquise of Glory, in her penitent years, was consumed above all by the fear of death. She who had been so bold in life was unmanned by the thought of dying, by the terror of the judgment she was sure awaited a soul as stained as hers. She could not bear to be alone in the dark. She kept her chamber blazing with candles through the night, and she paid women to sit with her and watch while she slept, or tried to sleep, so that she should never wake alone into the darkness she dreaded. The curtains of her bed were left open. The lights were never let go out. The most fearless woman of the court of the Sun King lay awake through her last years in a room full of light and watching faces, afraid of the dark like a child, afraid of the death she felt drawing nearer, doing penance with all her fierce strength and unable, for all of it, to quiet the dread in her heart. There is something almost unbearably human in the contradiction of it. By day she gave away her fortune and stitched for the poor and knelt through the long offices with a penitent's fervour, and reasoned, no doubt, that she was making her peace with God and need not fear to meet him. And then the night came, and the candles were lit, and the hired watchers took their places, and all the day's hard-won serenity drained away, and she lay there rigid in the blaze of light, listening to the small sounds of the house and the breathing of the women who watched her, and was simply afraid, with a bare animal fear that all her penance could not touch. She who had feared nothing in her glory, not the king's anger, nor the queen's hatred, nor the whispers of the poisoned court, feared now the one thing that comes for everyone, and feared it the more, perhaps for knowing so exactly how much she had to answer for. The lights burned on, the watchers watched, and the proud Mortemart spirit that had ruled a court and defied a church lay quaking in the dark like the convent child she had once been, waiting for a dawn that only briefly held the dread at bay. It is a strange and pitiable image with which to take leave of so dazzling a creature, and it brings us at the last to the place where she finally laid the long burden of herself down. In the spring of the year 1707, the Marquise, now in her 67th year, travelled to take the waters at Bourbon-l'Archambault, a spa town in the heart of France, where the great came to drink the healing springs and bathe their aging bodies. She had been ailing, and she went hoping for relief, but at Bourbon she fell gravely ill, and it became clear that the long-dreaded hour was upon her at last. The end, when it came, found her in a strange irony braver than her years of terror had promised. Faced at last with the death she had feared in the abstract through so many sleepless nights, she met the reality of it with a composure that surprised those about her. She made her confession, received the last rites of the church she had defied and returned to, asked pardon of those she had wronged, and disposed of her affairs with the clear-headed Mortemart sense that never wholly left her. On the 27th of May, in that year, Francoise-Athenais de Rochechouart de Mortemart, Marquise de Montespan, died, far from Versailles, far from the king, far from the glory that had once been wholly hers. It is one of the gentler mercies of her story that the dying itself, so long and so terribly dreaded, seems to have come to her at the last without the horror she had spent her nights rehearsing. The fear that had haunted her, the fear that filled her chamber with candles and watchers, was a fear of the approach of death, not the dark and the waiting and the imagining of it. When the thing itself arrived, plain and undeniable, she met it by the accounts that survive, with a courage that astonished those about her, as though the reality were somehow easier to bear than the long dread had been. She had her wits to the end, and used them to set her soul and her affairs in order, summoning her confessor, making her peace, asking forgiveness of those she could reach, disposing of her great wealth in legacies and charities. The proud Mortemart spirit, that had quailed in the night-time for years, rose to its full height for the one ordeal it could not avoid, and carried her through it with dignity. Whatever she had been, she did not die badly. When the news was brought to the king, he received it with a coldness that chilled even his hardened court. There was no grief, no softening, no tribute such as he had paid the gentle queen. He remarked only, "It is said that she had been dead to him for a long time already, and went about his day, and forbade his children by her to wear the deep mourning their hearts inclined to, lest the world be reminded too vividly of what their mother had been to him." It was a hard ending to a hard love, and the hardness was all on the side of the man who had once built her a palace and burned the kingdom's justice to shield her name. The children mourned her quietly, as they were permitted, and the great houses noted her passing, and the dazzling figure who had ruled the most magnificent court in the world slipped out of it almost without a ripple, as though she had never reigned there at all. Her children grieved more deeply than the king's coldness allowed them to show, for whatever her faults as a woman of the world, she had been to them a fierce and loving mother, and they had loved her in return. The Duc de Maine, the lame favourite, and the Comte de Toulouse, and the daughters now married into the highest houses of France, felt the loss of her keenly, the more so for being forbidden the open mourning that would have eased it. Her body was carried back toward the country of her people, the old Mortemart heartland, to be laid among her ancestors, those ancestors of whom the family had grown so proudly weary, and there, far from Versailles and far from the king who would not weep for her, what remained of Athenais de Mortemart was given at last to the earth. The court she had dazzled went on without a pause. The festivals and the intrigues and the slow business of the aging reign rolling forward, as though she had never been, and only her children, and a few old servants, and perhaps the poor she had succoured in her penitent years, kept any warmth of memory for the woman who had been the most envied creature in France. What are we to make of her, now that we have followed her from the convent at Sainté to the springs of Bourbon, from the green country of her birth to the blazing centre of Versailles, and out again into the grey penitential dark? She was not a good woman, and it would be false to pretend otherwise. She was proud past forgiveness, cruel to those she defeated, grasping in her ambition, and she did real harm to gentle people who deserved better of her. If even a part of the poison testimony was true, she touched things from which the soul recoils. And yet she was not a simple villain either, for she was brilliant beyond almost any woman of her age, a true wit and a true judge of genius, a patron whose protection helped to nurse the finest flowering of French letters, a creature of dazzling life and force, whose like the court would not see again. She was, above all, a creature who reached for the very summit of the world and grasped it, and held it for a decade, and then watched it taken from her piece by a quieter, patient, humbler rival, and who paid for her glory with a long old age of loneliness and fear and fierce, anguished repentance. History has not been kind to her on the whole, for history loves a clear story, and the Marquise refuses to be a clear story. The poison trials cast their long shadow over her name, and to most who know her name at all, she is little more than that shadow, the king's mistress who was whispered of among the poisoners, a figure of darkness in the bright morning of the great reign. Yet she was so much more than that, and the more is in danger of being lost. She was one of the great patrons of the most glorious age French letters have ever known, a woman whose taste and whose purse helped to shelter the very poets, whose words are now the glory of her language, and that surely is a truer monument than any whisper. There are, in the end, two immortalities contending for her, the dark one of the poison court and the bright one of the salon and the page, and which of them she most deserves is a question each of us must answer in our own hearts. Perhaps the fairest verdict is that she contained both, the patroness and the accused, the goddess and the penitent, and that to remember only one of them is to lose the strange and dazzling whole. There is a lesson somewhere in her story, though she would have hated to be made a lesson of, and I will not press it too hard upon you as you drift towards sleep. Perhaps it is only this, that the things we climb over others to reach have a way of being taken from us by the same arts we used to win them, and that the loudest glory and the deepest fear can live in a single heart, and often do. She had everything the world can give, and it did not save her from the dark she dreaded, and in the end the convent girl and the penitent old woman were closer kin than the dazzling Marquise between them would ever have believed. Hold her gently in your thoughts as the lights of her world go down, this clever, frightened, magnificent woman, gone now these 300 years and more, and let her rest. And now let the great palace fade. Let the candles in the long galleries gutter one by one and go out, 10,000 small flames sinking into the dark until only a few remain, and then none. Let the fountains fall silent in the gardens, and the water lie still and black under the stars. Let the music in the bosquets thin to a single held note, and then to nothing. The court has gone to its beds. The deposed Marquise sleeps at last without her watching candles, beyond all fear now, beyond all glory, at peace. The great rooms stand empty and quiet, the gold dimmed, the mirrors dark, the whole magnificent dream of Versailles dissolving softly into the night from which we drew it, until there is nothing left but the warmth of your own room and the weight of your own quiet breathing, here, 3 centuries and an ocean of years away from all of it. Before you slip away entirely, let me say one last gentle thing, and then I will leave you to your rest. Thank you for spending these few hours of the evening here with me, for letting these old lives and lost rooms keep you company as the day let go of you. If the time we have spent together tonight was something you would like to find again, on another evening when sleep is slow to come, then I will be here, and there will be another life and another world waiting, and you are always welcome to come back to it. There is no hurry. There is nothing left to do tonight but rest. Sleep well. Stay warm. Be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.